It's a pleasure to kick off with Janina, who is an associate professor here in the faculty in the chair of urban architecture. She, we had originally, because she's done a lot of work on shopping centers, asked her to speak on the shopping center as a building. She came back with a proposal to, which I think was fantastic, to talk about the drive-in church and to just open that up. And especially within COVID times, there has been, so she will talk about a certain historical moment in the post-war period, but now in COVID times, the drive-in church, along with the drive-in wedding chapel, the drive-in funeral, have become, let's say, re-emerging types. So I will introduce our other two colleagues, Jules and Filip, later, but we give the screen to you, Janina, because we're compressed with time. So thank you again for working with us to be able to be here today, considering the other commitments that you have. So, and maybe one thing we'll do is you will come to the Berlage in person and not on the screen, because this is like the third or fourth time. So.
Okay, I will try to make this work. Apologies. And I assume that I need to do this one, and then share computer sound. I hope you can now see the slides full screen.
Yes, perfect. It's perfect.
Sure. Well, good afternoon, and first I'd like to thank Salomon and the Berlage team for the kind invitation for me to participate in this symposium on this wonderful topic. The presentation today is titled From the Driving Church to the Drive-In Church. And before I begin, I would briefly like to say that for me this research is very new. In fact, up until now I've done hardly any research on drive-in churches, and I only became familiar with the type a couple of years ago because of a research project that I'm currently developing, which focuses on the role played by religious welfare organizations in processes of urbanization in the latter half of the 20th century. And then in the margin of that research, I came across this phenomenon of drive-in churches. So as Salomon already said, when he invited me to participate in this event, I thought this would be an ideal opportunity to gather the different bits of information that I had amassed to try to present a more or less cohesive narrative about this particular type. Apologies. So first, a bit about the car, or the auto. When Salomon mentioned the research project, The Auto Drives Architecture, the first thing that came to mind was this special issue of the French periodical Sciences et Vie, which translates as Life and Science, and it was published in 1959, and this is it here. And this special 500th edition of the journal was devoted to the theme La vie en l'an 2000, so life in the year 2000. And what is very interesting, I find, about this special issue that was published in 1959 is how the car was clearly seen as a driving force in everyday life in the year 2000. And here you see an image of what the journal imagined urbanity would look like in the year 2000. And this image immediately sort of foregrounds the prominent role attributed to the car. The journal anticipated that the car would alter the domestic sphere, so the sphere of the house. And here you see a family scene in which the young Luke is piloting a flying car while his parents follow a TV show from Peking on a flat screen television. And here I'm paraphrasing loosely from what is written below the drawing. And the journal also anticipated that developments in the automobile industry would change the public sphere, for instance, how people spend their free time. And here you see a scene of holidays in the Sahara, and the caption below the image reads, the car passes through vegetable gardens and orchards. The deserts have been reforested, and in Europe, the resulting choice of apples, cherries, and bananas from Touggourt are much appreciated. Now, of course, the public sphere and the sphere of free time or leisure also encompasses the sphere of religion, and it certainly did so in the mid-20th century. And I would argue that in the latter half of the 20th century, the interaction between developments in automobile technology and the sphere of religion was particularly affected by two important events and trends. First, by war, and second, by secularization and religious renewal. And first, we will briefly look at the impact of war, very, very briefly. Because as we all know, the First World War and particularly the Second World War had a devastating impact on Europe. Although in 1907 at the The Hague Conference, it was agreed that bombardments of undefended town, villages, dwellings or buildings would be prohibited. The war that erupted in 1939 caused enormous damage to the urban fabric of European cities. So by 1945, hundreds of cities were destroyed and millions of people were displaced. And this photo, for instance, shows the ruins of the German city of Dresden in 1944. Now, following this conflict, millions of displaced people from the former German Eastern territories poured into the 4 occupation zones in Germany, where sadly they found little access to shelter, food and clothing. And at this time, a Dutch priest called Werenfried van Straten, who you see here, started to organize help for the German neighbors from the Netherlands and also from Belgium. He called for a reconciliation with the former war enemies and asked that people donate food and clothing to help Germans in need. And to this end, in 1947, Werenfried founded the Oostpriesterhilfe, or Eastern Priests Aid, an organization that is today known as Kirche in Nood, so Church in Need. And because the organization initially, when they started in 1947, mainly collected bacon from Flemish farmers, they were called bacon priests or spekpaters, as you can see in this sign here next to the car door on the left. And then in order to help the displaced persons, not only materially, but also spiritually, in 1949, Priest Werenfried started the campaign called A Vehicle for God. And in many diaspora regions of Germany, where the expellees found a new place to stay, there was no Catholic church at the time. So in these largely Protestant areas of the North German diaspora, so-called rucksack priests were deployed to visit the widely scattered faithful on motorbikes and in small cars, as you can see on the left. And on the right-hand side, you can see Cardinal Joseph Frings blessing several Volkswagen Beetles that were to be used by these traveling priests. And in the following year, in 1950, Priest Werenfried started the Chapel Wagon campaign, and at this time 35 second-hand buses were converted into traveling chapels for pastoral care amongst the displaced persons. So these vehicles were quite literally driving churches, or maybe rather driving chapels. But perhaps of greater importance still for the interaction between developments in automobile technology and the rethinking of churches in the post-war period was the rise of secularization and the resultant period of religious renewal that this trend elicited. As we all know, during the 1960s and 1970s, numerous countercultural movements emerged and myriad countercultural events took place that sought to transform society. And the most salient feature of these countercultural movements was their reaction against conventions and dominant societal structures, including religion, which was a dominant societal structure. And well, this story is well known, but I'm just trying to get you into the atmosphere here. These countercultural movements, of course, had a very big impact on architecture, and they brought about a time of experimentation. For instance, as you can see here, with the design of lightweight and inflatable structures. On the top left, we have the Clean Air Pod by Ant Farm, and the other images shown on this slide are the Suitaloon by Archigram, which is basically a plastic suit that inflates to become a balloon. And these are, of course, only two in a very, very long list of experiments that took place in architecture at that time, many of which focused on the idea of ephemerality as well as greater freedom and autonomy for the individual. And these experiments also resonated in the sphere of religion. In the second half of the 20th century, population growth, suburbanization, and importantly, the rise of alternative forms of faith promised by countercultural movements made painfully plain that traditional forms of faith, and particularly Christian belief systems is what I'm talking about here, that these were insufficiently adapted to the modern world and a sort of emerging liquid modernity. So during the 1960s, as religious leaders embarked on a fundamental rethinking of the role of faith in society, think for instance of the ecumenical and liturgical movements within the Christian churches, architects enthusiastically joined their cause and they sought to express religious renewal in physical form. And a beautiful example in this respect is the inflatable church that German architect Hans-Walter Müller designed for Montigny-les-Cormeilles in France. This commune in the Parisian suburbs did not have a church in the 1960s, so Mass was held in a sort of shed. And Müller, who was very aware of this situation, approached the local priest and proposed to design and build an inflatable church for the congregation. Müller had long been fascinated by the possibilities afforded by inflatable structures. And then he designed the inflatable church that you see here, which was to be used during the parish festival that took place over the summer of 1969. And as you can see in these images, the inflatable church had very few spatial features that identified it as a church. I think that if I were to ask any of you gathered here today to quickly sketch a church, that it likely would not look like this inflatable church. But what was important for Müller was the possibility of extending the use of such a structure, for instance, for holding concerts. And he believed that the organization of cultural events in churches could then lead people to rediscover religion, or maybe just discover religion. And I know that strictly speaking, this is not a driving church nor a drive-in church, but it is a mobile church. This church only weighed 39 kilograms. It could be inflated in 10 minutes and it could accommodate 200 people. So it could be driven to any location and mounted there. And the idea here was that the church could be brought to the people. And this is what became very important for religious organizations in the latter half of the 20th century, when a shift occurred from the l'église visible, the visible church, to l'église accessible, the accessible church. And this was certainly also the idea underpinning the emergence of the drive-in church, a type that was popularized around the same time, but on the other side of the Atlantic, so in the United States. One of the earliest examples is the Nokomis Presbyterian Church that was designed by Victor Lundi in the first half of the 1950s. And this church was located on 8.5 acres of pine-covered property, which had been part of the former Venice Army Air Base. With little funds available, the idea was hatched to build a very small outdoor wooden two-story structure, and the bottom floor of this building housed the church school, and then the upper floor held the pulpit, the organ, and the choir. And this upper floor, as you can see in this image, was fully glazed. It had sliding glass doors that could be opened during church services. So the idea was that the congregation would not gather inside the building, but that they would be outside, allowing the parish to reduce the size of their church and thereby also the cost of its construction. So worshippers would drive onto the grounds in their cars and they would park at these designated speaker locations. And you can see these speakers here. So if necessary, then there were ushers who would help each driver attach the speaker to their open car window, as you see here, and they would later appear at each car window with collection plates during the service, as shown in this image on the bottom left. Now, if the Venice Nokomis Presbyterian was an early example of the drive-in church, you could say that Richard Neutra perfected the type. And this is likely the reason why his Garden Grove Community Church, which opened in Orange County, Los Angeles in 1960, is often misidentified as the world's first drive-in church. A driving force in the development of this famous drive-in church was Reverend Robert Schuller. And I don't know if there is, apart from Salomon, other Americans in the room, but he's quite a famous person in the US because he had a TV show, a Protestant television program called The Hour of Power, which was emitted every weekend. And Schuller began his church in Orange County in the early 1950s with virtually no money, which meant that he had to hold his first services in a drive-in movie lot, which is what you see in these images here. And these services were held on Sunday mornings when he rented the drive-in movie lot. And there he delivered sermons from the top of the concession stand, as is shown here. And he used the theater sound equipment that was then wired to each car. So by catering to Angelenos who were actually most comfortable in their cars, he quickly developed a following. And then by the late 1950s, with a greatly increased congregation, he commissioned architect Richard Neutra to design a church building that would not just be a regular church, meaning a church where churchgoers could actually come and sit inside the church, but that would serve both functions at the same time. So it was also to cater to those more comfortable in their cars. And here on the left, you see a plan of this church. So this here is a sanctuary space. Here on the right is where people who would sit inside the sanctuary would park their cars. And then this sort of moon-shaped parking lot is for those attending Mass from their car. And the device that Neutra used to negotiate this indoor-outdoor function of the church was the indoor-outdoor pulpit, which you see protruding here. So these large windows could slide open to allow Schuller to, from this indoor-outdoor pulpit, speak both to the sort of well-groomed, able-bodied, more traditional churchgoers inside, and then also the more laid-back crowd outside in their cars, which were parked on a slight incline to allow a maximum view of Schuller and the nearby choir. And the major difference between this complex and the Venice drive-in church was that Neutra dispensed with the individual sound boxes on the parking lot, and instead he relied on the individual car radios that carried the broadcast of the service inside. And if all goes well, we'll now watch a short 3-minute film that shows this drive-in church in operation.
California, though, has also given us a unique way to celebrate life, to worship. This, for instance, is one of the numerous drive-in churches that serve its mobile culture. Here, people simply drive their cars in front of a church onto a gigantic parking lot, set their radios to a church transmitter so they can follow the services without having to leave their cars, as glass walls roll back on the pulpit to bring the minister into the view of the congregation. For those, however, that still care to venture outside their cars, but perhaps more as a concession, a spacious sanctuary is provided.
This is the day that God has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. And God has given to you who are in your cars this morning a beautiful overcast so that you are worshiping in cool comfort. Why don't you share the thanks for that with somebody sitting near you with a smile or a wave? And those of you who are in the sanctuary, equally comfortable, I am sure, on this delightful summer Sunday morning, won't you share the radiance of your joy and of your love with somebody sitting near you? Shake hands with somebody at your side or behind you and say, I love you. Try it. And God loves you. Thank you very much. And now I think we are ready for the morning offering. Your tithes and free will.
The main attraction of the drive-in church, naturally, is the lack of Sunday formality. And the worshipers are apt to show up in everything from bathing suits to pajamas.
Shall we pray? Father in heaven, we're deeply grateful that you have given us the capacity to hear and to understand. Now give us the capacity to act and to do. We shall be brought into account for all of the privileges and the opportunities that we have had. And in that day of account, we want the Master to say, well done. Good and faithful servant, enter thou into the joy of your Lord. And now let us stand for the benediction. And now, beloved, the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, The love of God our Father and the communion of the Holy Spirit be with you and remain with you always, world without end. Amen.
Then, having found spiritual revivification, it's time again for the freeways, or perhaps just a brief stop at the church fast food snack bar for a donut or a hot dog.
Sorry. So by way of conclusion, I believe that this short film segment that we saw could be understood or could be read as a cultural critique of the type, certainly when you see the images of people sleeping in their cars or leafing through Playboy magazine during the church service. But if this film is a cultural critique, the building was not spared from architectural criticism either. A review that was published in the journal Oppositions in 1980 stated that the building came off as rather tired and lifeless, falling prey to the most banal cliches of late modern architecture, and that any attempts that Neutra had made to warm it up with the use of materials such as the natural stone that you see here was actually incompatible with the automobile ambience. So the piece published in Oppositions expressed regret that no greater effort was made to relate the building to the car, either in form or in materiality or in other symbolic or iconographic ways. However, in his 1971 book, Los Angeles, The Architecture of Four Ecologies, Rainer Banham did posit that the building summed up quietly and monumentally what the peculiar automotive mania of Los Angeles is all about, not least in the way so much of its detailing and silhouette uncannily recall the characteristic detailing of such accepted monuments of Autopia as 5-minute car washes or Ship's coffee shop on Wilshire Boulevard. So as you can tell, while Banham did believe that the building responded to LA's car culture, he did not hold it in very high regard either. So perhaps the sum of such critique is the reason why in the latter half of the 20th century, the drive-in church did not become very common or ubiquitous as a type. But that said, neither did the inflatable church, which was apparently a great success in Montigny-les-Cormeilles. Rather than the drive-in church, the driving church or the inflatable church, the house church became the dominant paradigm imposed for decades to cater to growing and increasingly suburban populations. And this was the case both in the US and in Europe. And these house churches were small domestic scale churches that were fully integrated into their suburban neighborhoods. And they thus served contemporary car culture in a very different way than the drive-in church or the inflatable church had envisaged. And I'll conclude there. Thank you.
Thank you. I know you need to go now, so if we see you back later after your next appointment, maybe then we can open it to questions. Is that okay?
Yeah, sorry.
Or,
can you repeat
oh, sorry.
it?
You need to go now, right? You have an appointment at 3. So I was going to suggest that if you come back afterwards, we can maybe ask questions then. So that
sure.
Don't miss your appointment since we started a little bit later, if that's okay. So
yeah, I'll rejoin after the other.
Exactly.
Okay.
All right.
See you soon.
Bye.
Thanks.
See you soon. Bye. So now you guys have time to think of questions, Mr. California. Hi, Jules.
You're continue now?
Yeah, we continue. So this is Jules Schoonman, who's the policy advisor for academic heritage here at the TU Delft. He's a parking garage enthusiast. So when we started to put together this program, helped him to basically finally turn this kind of enthusiasm into into a presentation and to see where this goes. So again, this is a work in progress. So thank you for sharing with us your love of the parking garage. And we look forward to your tour of Rotterdam parking garages with Thomas later next week. So the screen is yours. Thank you.
Thanks. The work stops here. No process. Let me see. Am I sharing something now?
Yeah, you're perfect.
All right. Okay. Well, thank you all for having me digitally in that space. Thank you, Salomon, for the invitation, and Janina for kicking off. But she's left now. Okay, so I would like to talk about indeed my interest in parking garages, and this has to do with the fact that Susanna Peach, who works at Interiors, has introduced me once to this roof, which is next to the Bijenkorf in Rotterdam. And I was quite impressed by it, and it has a beautiful sloping roof in two directions. And I thought it was a beautiful space, and because of this, I developed an initiative when I would invite guests to Rotterdam to give them a little tour of the parking roofs of the city. And I think you recognize this, Salomon. There are spaces that are very interesting because you're really just at a very interesting point in height where the lower buildings of the city stop and the towers begin rising above. You're sometimes very close to nearby buildings, the ability to look in. Obviously, these are mostly empty spaces because most drivers do not go up fully. They're also, I mean, they're, you see it here just after the rain, they have a beautiful surface effect. Well, there are many. This was the Laplace. I don't know if you're familiar with that. This then became the Hudson's Bay and then got bankrupt. It's now empty, unfortunately. Another one near the Lijnbaan where the Albert Heijn is. The split level type is very popular in Rotterdam. This is another kind of a parking roof, which is the Shell Tower, where the parking garage is actually next to the tower, and the upper roof cuts into the tower itself, and it's the parking that separates the lower part of the Shell building and the upper part. And this is a bit reminiscent of Maaskan's architecture. You see the Hilton in the back, and the Hilton Hotel has a similar separation, although there's no parking in between. This is the Broek Bakema garage, where the reinforced concrete structure is then added to that is a little steel building where the escalators are. And this is, I think this might be a place to visit next Tuesday, as it is a very high density residential area with a lot of parking needs. But here's my question. Sometimes when I visit these places, I note that that architects do not fully appreciate them. This is a garage just behind Kees Dam's building at Westblack, and here it's also a split level type, but here the facade sort of runs horizontal over the two levels, so it's very high on one side and then a bit shorter on the other. And I was wondering, like, why is the actually interesting split level system not expressed on the outside? And you'll be amazed what the building looks on the outside. I'm sorry to say it in this setting, but it's a little bit like student housing, and well, very uninspired use of these brick panels. And so again, like, what, why is there no expression of this concrete? I think this is even a steel and concrete combined construction. Why does it always need to be covered up while there are so many beautiful things inside? And this is a similar example where the architects began greenwashing the parking roofs and the parking garages with ivy. I don't think it's actually very easy to have other plants growing. And again, you see the similar idea where the roof needs a horizontal ending. You see the columns on the right are taller than on the left. And yeah, I'm very skeptical of this, but mainly, what it removes for me is the experience of being on the roof and having the open view in all directions, which clearly is now covered with ivy. And here's another example near Rotterdam Central Station, where actually you have a beautiful view of Rotterdam Central Station, except for the for the little plane of ivy that somehow forbids us to see that. And even when these garages have beautiful facades, they're like hidden in the, or beautiful, okay, but when they have nice facades, they're hidden in these little alleyways, and they're not really visible from the street. Or when they have beautiful elements that could actually also, this is like basically a little Guggenheim in the center of Rotterdam, but it is hidden behind the translucent glass. This is a parking by mascot. And the only suggestions to open up this facade are gestures like these, where this speaks for itself. But here you can see the reinforced concrete system. So the theme of covering garages up is very old. It's there from the beginning. This is from the Architects and Builders magazine, and this is a private garage in New York. And I don't know if you can read this, but it says, nothing on the exterior, however, distinguishes its purpose as a garage. To all appearances, it does not differ from the usual type of private stables found in the city. And then it continues describing the interior. Actually, the facade is covered in red Dutch brick. And by the way, I had a bit of a shock when I saw this, because it's a garage for electric vehicles, and apparently 30% of cars in the 1900s were electric. So most of these early garages had a lot of equipment to serve electric cars. Also, when we look in the Netherlands, it's the first multi-story garage in the Netherlands, the Torengarage in The Hague, which you may have visited already, or you may visit tomorrow, I think. And here is a similar issue, because it's not only the first Dutch garage parking, but it is also the first continuous ramp. So it's a continuous ramp spiraling upward, and this is in one way expressed in the facade, in the curved forms, but the spiral itself is not expressed. The facade acts like there are traditional stories in a garage, which there are not. And of course, you cannot really look in. It's a translucent system, and there are the bricks again. So I was looking for another kind of example to share with you, and Benjamin kindly reminded me of a building which has recently been finished in Amsterdam, the Van der Valk Hotel at the Zuidas, near the Amsterdam Rai station. And this is a bit of a different type, which I was impressed by. And the Van der Valk Hotel, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but they are a chain of hotels which are very car friendly. They're usually situated close to the highway, and they can be recognized not by the falcon but by the toucan. And perhaps you've seen it around. They also have, by the way, this is not it's a bit of a biased selection of their portfolio, but they also have very nice hotels. And this is their most recent branch, I think, at the Zuidas in Amsterdam, which was designed by Wielretz architects. And what is interesting about the building is that the garage is fully, let's say, part of the architecture. The hotel normally sets a standard of 1 car or 1 parking place per room. And in this case, let me just check it to be sure. The hotel has 235 rooms, and a maximum of 150 cars was set by the municipality. So there was actually the hotel was like forced to limit the offer for the car owners, and also encourage people to use public transport. And there was no opportunity to put this parking beneath ground, because at the site, as there are all these, there's a lot of important infrastructure related also to the tower and to the energy station you see behind the building. So it had to be put above ground, and the architects used this actually to lift the entire building up, to lift even the hotel lobby up to the 5th floor. Which then provides also a view over the highway and over the city. So the whole garage is actually used as a kind of table, and then they've actually tried to add also functions to the garage to sort of to make it less monotonous as having only a single functionality. And I think you can already see this quite clearly. If you look at the building itself, where you see actually the exposed concrete construction of the facade, and it sort of stops with this horizontal plane, and from there on builds forward the let's say packed building. You know, from there onwards, you can actually, you know, the construction is no longer exposed, let's say, to the outside, but I like the fact that, you know, this table is, let's say, the last gesture to the rest of the building, while at the same time the building elements of the building appear in the parking garage again. So there's a kind of interrelationship between the parking downstairs and the building upstairs. Interestingly enough, it's a triangular plan, just based on the side, there's a whole play with triangles in the design. There's a triangle that cuts the entry out of the ground floor, and there's a triangle cutting through on the other side, where also there's the entrance to the parking garage, and another entrance to the ground floor lobby, which is basically only a hub to go to the lobby on the 5th floor. And then you see all these leftover triangles, and you see this happening more in the building. This is the side of the entrance of the parking garage, and you can really see how it's not how it's a very comfortable space. It's tall enough. You have the reflection of the roof and the ground. There's even a large screen sort of welcoming, but there's also the opening to the actual hotel, so it's also a drop-off point. So they've really included it rather than putting it at the back. You can also see how you see actually the cars standing there from the outside. And then on the floors of the parking garage, which is obviously not the most efficient parking garage, but it wasn't also needed to be, because there was this clear limit on the amount of cars. You can actually see the vertical elements, like the staircases, the central elevators, and they are all presented on these floors as, let's say, buildings, not as vertical elements, but as horizontal elements belonging as part of that level. And you can see the next photo is taken from this point, where you actually look down and you see the screen, and here you see the columns. I'll mention those. I'll talk more about those later. And you see that some of these inserts, let's say, in the parking are actually open displays of the climate installations, a little bit, you know, like the Foster's building in Ipswich, I was reminded of. And they are also, let's say, part of, you know, the public display of the mechanical side of the hotel. This is an example of one of these available, in this case, like an office space right in the parking. So the height of the parking has actually been raised, that inside the parking you can actually add isolation, and you can add a ceiling, and then you have still the height required by Dutch law. This is the next floor. Let me see what, and here I would like to point out that the building has, and it's also because of its triangular shape, the building has a very interesting pattern of columns. From the station, it really looks very rhythmic, but then you actually see that no column, like all the columns are very interestingly placed. They're never in the way, but they're also, you cannot really distinguish the logical, let's say, grid, and also they have different dimensions, and these are based on what they are load bearing. And here you see the Mini Cooper parked between one of those two columns. You see that the columns have a combination of convex and concave surface, which is I'm sort of reading this as a dialogue with the triangular very hard angles of the building in its totality. And it's also, I think, a way, because these columns return in the interior of the hotel, to really connect vertically the garage downstairs and the hotel upstairs. Obviously, these flowers are so much more, they're so much nicer than the ivy of the roofs that I showed in Rotterdam, but I have to admit that it's fake. On the other side, they've actually tried maintaining it, but well, to no avail. This is still something to solve, but it turns out it's very difficult to keep these plants under a roof. On the next floor there, I found a little artist studio. Apparently some of these places are rented cheaply to people in the surroundings as part of the social return of the hotel. I'm a bit skeptical of this. I think that these are the people that are renting this are also acquainted with the hotel owners. But he was an artist working in one of those corners. Her name is Lisette Castillo, and she said that the car owners did not really have any interest in what she was doing over there, because they were so focused on their car that they didn't even notice the fact that there was a studio here. Reminded me a bit of projects of Le Corbusier, where he's building all kinds of activities on the roof of parking garages, and there's a wider fascination for this in the pre-war period. So on the last floor of the garage, there's a huge climate installation. Again, unfortunately, this one is filled with explanations. And then in the hotel lobby, there's the dressed version of the building, but there we still have these columns that we recognize from the garage. So there you really see the purpose of them. And these columns run up one more floor, and then there's another table, and from there onwards it's a prefab construction where the hotel rooms are. And I think that how this building works with this triangular shape and contains all these well, I mean, it tries to solve everything also in detail with working with its limitations, so to speak. I think it's a nice reply to the formalism of the OMA building, which is also triangular on the other side of the highway. And I thought this was a nice gesture towards that. So this is the last part of my talk. The other thing I did is look back at the very beginning of garages in Europe, and this is the first multi-story garage of Auguste Perret in Paris, and the building does not exist anymore. And it is interesting that this building is actually still very inspirational because it's one of the first building which expressed its construction also in its facade. So even for a garage, it's still a building I think to learn from. And I'll show you the plan a little bit. So this is the entry of the building, and as you can see, all the parking spaces are a little bit rotated, and this is to ease, the curve for driving the car into the space. And you see that the constructional, it's a reinforced concrete building, and you see that the grid of the construction is completely aligned to fit two cars. What you see here is not, let's say, lines on the ground, but it's actually boxes for the car. So they were actually, well, you see it actually on this picture, and this was taken from the horse stables, because the horses were also always kept in these kinds of boxes, and at the back of the boxes you would have all kinds of equipment to take care of the horse, and in the garage you would have equipment to take care of your car. So this is for the ground floor, but how to go to the second and third floor? Well, there is a rotating area here where you can turn the car, a turntable, into the elevator over here. Then it is brought upstairs. Car is moved out onto this bridge, and this bridge is electric, so it can actually move back and forth in the central nave, and then the car is parked on either side. So these cars are being taken down or maybe parked on that other side. Interestingly, you can see that the columns in the place of the elevator are reclined there over here. So they do not follow, let's say, the grid line, and this has to do with getting the cars into this elevator. You can also see, by the way, that the floor continues here to the back, so the nave doesn't continue in this direction. But what I wanted to say about the columns is, here you actually see this column, but what Berlage has done is he has actually added another column in the original spot on the first floor, because he actually, and this is an architectural decision, because he didn't want to disturb the rhythm more than needed. And you can actually see that it doesn't really support anything, because there's a second column next to it which does the work. Other than that, Berlage, I mean, this was not a building in which Berlage in the interior could experiment a lot with the shapes and the casting of the concrete. Oh, by the way, here you see this cantilevered column, and you see the two fits for the columns right above it. And this is the design for the facade, and this is really the first place where Berlage tries to make a facade for a building which only works, let's say, with the constructional logic of it, and doesn't try to fill in like with his apartment building in Rue Franklin, where he still fills in, let's say, the concrete frame. In the case of the Garage Pontier, he's really using the constructional system behind it. You can see here that the columns align with the expression on the facade, except actually for this case here, where it doesn't, and I'll show you why. And another thing to note is that he actually added effect also to this facade. So you can see actually in the section that the beams really land on the facade. So it's not a facade in front of it or anything. It's the columns in the facade actually do carry the floors right behind it. But he has also applied a diminution of the facade. You can see this line, which slowly is a little bit like that, but a slight entasis even, so a slight swelling of these verticals is also happening on the front. And here you can see a picture of it. I don't know if I just told you this, but the building has been demolished in the 1970s, or unfortunately it doesn't exist anymore. here you can see actually this little part of the facade on the left, where, you know, which is a bit of a mystery, like why is this there? These are the concrete columns of the facade, which almost reverse the logic of the interior, where the horizontal dominate and on the outside the vertical dominates. And you see that the facade really starts to work as almost like a section of the building, but at the same time also showing the plan with this central rose window, you know, hinting at this large nave space and the glazing above. But at the same time, as Gideon writes, it becomes like an irrelevant part of the facade because, you know, the emphasis, as Perret himself will continue to emphasize more on the embellishment of the construction rather than the inserts. And then the top floor has an office purpose, so it also has a different appearance. And on the ground floor, there were also offices and at some point also a showroom. I should also mention that the garage worked with an elevator to move these cars upstairs, but this also had to do with the fact that these cars could not really drive up ramps yet. They were not powerful enough, and that the cars were usually driven by chauffeurs, and these had a separate space in the building as well, and a space to clean the car. So the garage was usually a place where, you know, everything that you would have for horses in the stables, you would have for cars in the garage. And this is also a little bit the mystery of the bay on the left, where actually the columns, the left side of the building is developed differently than the right side of the building. The columns are slightly off the building's the left wall. And this has to do with the fact that they planned an extension of the garage. And this is also why he almost left a part of the facade open to extend it maybe in the future. Another photography of it. Here you see this little gap. And you can also look a little bit inside where you see the construction. And the inside again with the bridges, and you see the boxes where the cars are in. And I think this is the last image I had from Gideon's building in France, where he speculates on the uses of the roofs of the garages for other purposes. But this was mainly included to link back to the beginning of my talk.
Thank you. So how shall we do this? Nice presentation. Who has a question? Michael?
Sure.
To get the ball rolling, maybe we need to come to the camera here.
Hi, Jules. I don't know if you can see me well or hear me well. I hope so.
I can.
I don't think I'm going to be part of your excursion as I'm not a masterclass participant, but I'm curious, how do you access these rooftops as a pedestrian? Or do you sneak in with a car or a bicycle?
Yeah, well, the joke is I don't even have a driver's license, so I'm completely illegal. But yeah, there are multiple ways. So I sneak in after a car sometimes, and some of the garage have, you know, they have like pedestrian paths, you know, going inside when you pick up your car again. So some of them actually are quite open, and in that sense you can actually walk in and find your way. But some are really closed off, and the most difficult ones are more private. And then what usually works is you have to look for the other entrance, because, for example, with the Keesdam garage, with the student facade, I actually got in because it has a little footbridge with the other building. So I took the entrance of the other building where there was a mail delivery guy just coming out, and I could immediately walk into the garage, although it was closed off itself on the ground floor. So yeah, I think it's easier as an individual than with a group of 20 students. So I have absolutely no clue how we will do this next week. But I will try to explore the ones that we could enter.
Philip, I wondered if you had any questions, as you're also a parking garage enthusiast and probably would have preferred to give this talk instead of your own on the business.
I'm also apologies, Philip, that I didn't include panorama parking in Brussels.
Yeah, I was thinking about that.
Yeah, sorry. I also did not include Melnikov's designs.
But I think it's, I mean, there is this kind of I think that maybe there is some kind of border somewhere where let's say not so much because there may be sort of almost authorless structures sometimes, if you can call it like that. Of course they are not, but and then there is a border where it sort of enters the realm of the sort of the fantastical, right? So I think there is yeah, a kind of fine kind of line where it still is part of some kind of more a discussion on how it on a sort of more fundamental background level relates to the operation of a city. And that's what I like about the kind of documentary approach, also this sort of unspectacular aspects, how there is a kind of yeah, a kind of rule behind.
The strangest thought I had when preparing this was that if cars were invented earlier, there would have been more involvement of engineers with designing these structures, like, for example, with railway stations, where you have always the engineering side and the architect side. And it's unfortunate that the car has been introduced, you know, like these garages were only needed in the early 2000s or, sorry, 1900s. And because, you know, then already architects start designing it and they were covering it up right away. So it never really got the chance to be appropriated by engineers. Of course, there are some examples, but it became too much.
You sound like some. You sound like Louis Mumford. This kind of idea. You would say something like, I think in Techniques and Civilization, like cars came to the city either too early or too late.
Yeah.
Things never happen when they could have the sort of the kind of impact they kind of accompany. So these things, the technology in general kind of relates, is either a kind of belated answer or a sort of anticipated.
And this was really funny when I read about the stables, because that really, it's I have a couple of images still about this. These are the stables of the Magasin de Bon Marché in Paris, and you can actually read it as a parking plan. It also has like a double. It has sort of like it has two floors, and it has a ramp on the outside, as you can see on the plan. And actually, the facade aligns pretty well with the boxes for the horses. So it's really kind of it's an expression of the internal logic. And then the building is even still in Paris, but it's now a part. It's been added to it, and it's now apartments. But it was funny to me that if you want to understand the architecture of the garage, you have to start more in the stables than in the engineering structures that you would expect, with all the ramps and more the exposed concrete that you know you would initially think of.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the Panorama building, which is one of your, let's say, more official obsessions. You mentioned the one in Brussels, which then was converted to a garage, which I don't know what its fate ultimately is, because that boulevard, the Boulevard en Spach, became a bit pedestrianized, and although the entrance to the parking is from the back side or from the opposite side, I'm not sure how it happened. But what's interesting there is that it's a kind of, I think, in what is it, a late 19th century structure.
Yeah.
Because it, yeah, it's contemporary, let's say, to the Waterloo painting, I think, when it was built, no?
Yeah.
Before it was moved out to Waterloo. That then this kind of creates this sort of, not just the reuse, but also this kind of idea of a substandard reuse. I don't know if you remember that when we visited, this SUV hit the ceiling when it entered. So it was also, it started to have this function of like, the parking garage is not just a passive. It's sort of,
Well, but if
kind
you,
of a saying the cars are getting too big.
But if you take the parallel further, then the double helix of the panorama was really also a way to disorient the visitors of the panorama, that they would be more open to the experience within the rotonda. So it had a particular purpose of disorientation, which absolutely also happens in the parking garage.
Right.
And in some way, the parking garage is where you're in this vehicle. You have to you need maybe a little bit of this experience before going out into the city. So
right,
it's
like a sort of suspension of disbelief before you at the end of the movie credits, right? After having looked at the landscape, and a sort of threshold moment.
Yeah.
No, I would agree. And another one on the same Boulevard Anspach, I don't know, the famous, it's very similar to your story about the roof parkings of Rotterdam, and let's say the combination of arriving in the city, parking on the roof, and sort of first having the panoramic, the kind of overview, and then that was the parking 58, so which was built in the city center, contemporary to the expo, on a site. I don't know what they demolished to build it. With kind of quite interesting structure with some floors, like it was a regular building, but some floors were occupied by offices, sort of randomly to a point, and then the rest was parking. So it would change, but then the roof was entirely parking, and the sort of the ramp cylinder was only on one side, and that got demolished, I think, 2 years ago. Because it started, but it was this sort of this kind of magnificent moment, you would sort of enter the city, park on top. It had a kind of interesting history. It was based, I think, on the engineer, this Blaton, who then together with the guy who started Interparking, which is a company that still exists and has parking garages, I think, at least all over Europe, but maybe in the world. Sort of copied the idea of the multi-story garage, and also some of the engineering, the construction principles from the Battery Park garage in downtown Manhattan from the early 50s. And then, kind of put that there really as a speculative garage. Like say, the expo is happening. There was no planning involved. Probably there is going to be a lot of cars. Let's build this to make money. And then economically, it was quite interesting, because at some point later in the life of this garage, it started to be marketed as the cheapest airport parking of Brussels airport. So in the center of Brussels, because you would pay less than at the airport, and they would offer a shuttle to the airport. So a complete sort of reversal of the logic of destination and parking.
This reminds me that I forgot to put in a little photo of the signage that is usually used in a garage, that you can locate your car again. And I thought this was typical kind of project for Salomon to explore.
Because
you have like the
clump,
panda bear level, squirrel level.
different tunes. They have different
colors,
background music.
Oh, that too, yeah.
Great. Are there any questions, guys? Okay. Well, it's all the non-masterclass participants. Berlage games that have questions.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. I was really interested in the part that in the early parking garage they have to use the elevator to move the car upstairs, because apparently cars weren't so strong or powerful enough to drive itself up to the second floor or even the third floor. And now, if we look at the previous examples, is like yeah, they can be really high, these car parking towers. So I wonder what do you think of this kind of space shifting or changes that happens along with the advancement or the iteration of cars?
Yeah. I was also grabbed by this fact. It also has to do with lack of space, because these parkings were built, in residential areas where there was not enough space for parking. And still today you see sometimes solutions with elevators or automatic parking solutions. So in that sense, but then there was also the reason that the cars itself could not pull themselves up. What was I thinking? Yeah, that what interests me in Ville Arret's building is that it is not innovative in this sense. Like, I mean, it is very straightforward in the ramp upward. You see with a lot of garages that this is the key feature that they are exploring and putting all the effort in, and then sort of forgetting the actual garage space. And I think what you see in Pere, but then I emphasize this more in Ville Arret's building, is that there's somehow a little bit of a reclined attitude to what that how innovative you need to be in this respect. Actually, the ramp is the most, also in construction, in the field of construction, is the most straightforward part. And then actually all the effort is really in the garage itself and the design of the prefab columns and the post-stress floors, eliminating the beams. So I wonder if the, again, like I'm thinking in a 19th century way, but the engineering view would really be about, ramps and going up and, sort of floating in space with your car. And it's a little bit expressed by Melnikov's projects for the parking in parkings in Paris. But on the other hand, the architect's view is actually more focused on the design of the parking itself, and this is a speculation. This was a thought I had about the vertical transportation of cars in these buildings.
Sebastian.
Hi there, thank you for the talk. In your presentation, you mentioned architectural parking lots almost as buildings and how they are facades and viewpoints across the city. And I was wondering why you almost omitted the subterranean parking lots, which are now kind of the present approach towards architecture, which almost focus more on the internal experience of a parking lot than looking out from a parking lot. And also, if you have any historical background on when these emerged as a typology.
Yeah, you're completely right. I looked at the above ground parking, or the hooggarage, but that's also because that has a public face to it, that becomes architecture, because it poses a problem of the facade. And it's for this reason that also in this case, because presenting this in an architectural setting, I thought it was more interesting to focus on this. So unfortunately, I don't have much to say about this. The only thought I had about it was that when I was on these roofs in Rotterdam, I also realized that, for example, the way that West 8 has designed the the square, is it called the Schouwburgplein in Rotterdam, where the cinema is, and the Doelen, the theater. It was actually designed almost as a roof of a parking garage. Like it has that quality to it. So if you read it in that way, the square makes much more sense. But I haven't really dived into the topic more than that.
But in function of that, Philip, can you refresh my memory with Jacques Goubler, the ostrich and what is the expression? The ostrich.
I can look it up. I don't remember the title of the lecture.
But basically, Jacques Goubler, he had this kind of, we can find, we'll send you guys the link, but it's basically, he's talking about infrastructure and things that were above ground, like train stations, or as you observed, which I think was quite nice, that are now submerged. And then there was this whole, the title of the lecture was very poetic. It was, the ostrich, which puts its head into the earth. Anyways,
right.
Tangent but related. The Mariano. Yep. Question quickly.
I'll try. So, hi, I'm Mariano. I usually make long questions. So
long commentaries.
Oh, thanks.
So,
I don't have to answer.
So actually, I was interested about the behavior of people, because first you mentioned so quickly something very interesting for me, that people in the cars never look into the art studio because they were busy with their stuff. And so it's interesting to me because you kind of put these this behavior into parallel realities where people that were there were doing their stuff, using the car is focused. So if you tell me more about this.
Yeah, no, but that was very brief. Thank you. No, I thought it's similar to the horses, right? I mean, if you love your horse and there's an artist working next to it, you're not paying attention to the artist, you're going right to your horse. So when I saw the stable analogy, it made total sense to me. I mean, I'm not a car owner, but I'm, I can sort of get it through through that experience. But this is also what's part of the fascination of the cover up. Like, why are these buildings, why is it so necessary to cover them up? Because people are proud of their cars, no? And cars are nice objects, no? I mean, yeah, they have all these kinds of curved surfaces and they reflect in all different directions. I mean, they take up a lot of space and they're not nice in many ways, but I do appreciate that. So I can enjoy cars most when they're just parked, I think. So why is it so necessary to cover it up and to not show these vehicles? And this is what I like about the VLRS building, because it's such an easy turnaround of an existing concept. It just changed one logic. Like, okay, let's just treat the garage as with the same kind of attention and quality as the bedrooms upstairs. That's what they did. And I think, of course, if you would add a couple of iterations, then I think, in the end you will have bedrooms in the parking garage. That could be a way to go. Also thinking that if you have more electric cars, then these garages are cleaner, so they are even more pleasant places to be. But I think that this building has a couple of these future aspects. It grasped the potential of these places still, which
Great, thank you. Is there one final question before we move on to the next? Can you try from there, Danae? If people can hear you, I'm curious.
Hi, I'm Danae.
Microphone.
Hello.
I have a question regarding the life of the parking buildings. I mean, as structures, there are parking buildings, but if for some reason they have to stop being parking building, what is happening to them? So maybe if I can make it more general, like the sustainability of a parking building.
Yeah. No, so this is the main issue, right? So if you build a parking garage and you build it efficiently, you have a limited floor height. I think you limit the floor height to what is, let's say, the regulations for the interior, but if you would like to use the building otherwise, then you can never add insulation to it or installations to it, so it becomes like an inflexible building. And this is very odd because parkings are very flexible. I mean, parkings usually are the basis for the floor plan of most residential buildings. Most residential plans are derived from the logic of the parking garage downstairs. So parkings are actually, you could build all kinds of functions into that. And the logic of the architect. I talked to the project architect of the Berlage building, and he said that. Let me just try to even quote him. He said everything should be able to change. You do not want the construction to intersect, let's say, with the installation. Installation should also be able to change. And they've actually raised the height of the parking that it could accommodate structures which would follow regulations. And I think also part of the beauty of the building is that the parking is not compressed, like in many of these buildings. Also, if you look at the Rotterdam building, you have always like a big black box where the parking is, and it's usually a couple of compressed floors. But in this case, actually the floors are not compressed; it's the opposite, and they have even the same height as the hotel floors upstairs. So I think that's and he said that actually raising that is not even that much of added cost. So it was an interesting, again, like a very subtle change, which allows the building to be something completely different in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jules. I'm just reminded of something about the question of parking spots as a kind of tangent to everybody. A slight digression is there is maybe Filip, you remember where this is? The Zaha Hadid station is in Mulhouse, where basically there's the open parking lot, I think it's from around the year 2000, something like that, 2001.
North of Strasbourg.
Ah, yeah, Strasbourg. Yeah, exactly. Thank you.
Hernheim. It's some kind of park and ride.
Yeah. So we're basically the graphics of the parking spot got Zaha Hadid formalism. So it went at like a kind of I don't know, 32-degree angle or something like this. But she parking right, but there's a kind of architecture, very quite elegant project. And then really I'm always very curious about how she made the patterning of the parking spot Zaha Hadid like, so a kind of language within the rules of the conventions of basically what you need to be able to realize the parking structure within parking and things like that. So this is one of these projects that I think is very interesting, but sort of not remembered.
I'm looking at them. It's interesting. And
Yeah.
some of that is also in the design by UN Studio next to the Erasmus Bridge. You see sort of
Yeah, that's true too.
maturation there.
Yeah.
It's nice that these parkings are always indicated, right? You always know where to park your car. There's this little space around the car, so it's almost like an invisible box around the car. And this really you can take this back to the boxes in the stables for the horses. And I think it's a beautiful thing that the car always needs a little bit of space sort of around it, like a little rectangle. And so looking at the Zaha project, that she's trying to change the conception of that, rectangular space around the car into something different, maybe in a kind of parallelogram in Dutch.
Well, and as a side note, before we give it to you, I'm just now thinking the very first project in Vitra, the fire station, there's also the way you park into the fire truck, how it's aligned with how you park into the garage itself. So it's also interesting.
Yeah.
All right, cool. Thank you. Filip, Filip is around the Berlage, around TU Delft. You guys have seen him. He's an assistant professor of architecture here in the department. And he has been teaching the last two iterations of Project Vulcan. This last third one with you all. We have asked him to give a talk on, the business park. Maybe there's a few other booths folded in. Philip?
Great, thank you. Can you hear me? Good?
Yeah, perfect.
I will share my screen. All right, I hope it's not gonna be too long. I'll try to hurry up. So first of all, I apologize for the misleading title, as I want to basically satisfy those of you who really want to see something about business parks by showing this picture, because I think it's the only sort of it sort of synthesizes all the kind of aspects which I won't be able to go into. So this is an image of Las Colinas near Dallas in Texas, as a kind of almost proverbial example of what Joel Garreau in the early 90s coined as Edge City, right? Some kind of episode in the ongoing recalibration and reinvention of what we in general refer to as, urban sprawl, the suburbs. What I'm decide to do is to really kind of focus on this car aspect and one particular sort of moment, which I think is the peak of, let's say, this sort of automotive emancipation, rather than this more hybrid kind of wannabe urban conditions like El Ranchito de las Colinas. Okay, so I go into it. Allow me, this is of course, the Uffizi in Florence. Uffizi meaning offices, specifically at the time built for the Medici, the moment they basically consolidated princely power for the administration of the state, kind of an adaptation of Vasari, not only of the organization of this bureaucracy in the city, but as well as a kind of urban space, a kind of hybrid between a courtyard and a street. In addition to the Uffizi, there is the corridor by Vasari, this kind of meandering pathway going through existing buildings, at some point crossing the Arno River on top of the Ponte Vecchio, is eventually on the on the right side of the image, reaching the Pitti Palace at the Boboli Gardens, the kind of residence of the Medici, as a kind of private route through the city, a kind of total architecturalization of a commute, you could say, from your work to your residence. And I think this is kind of frames very well this kind of role of the car in urban development, and especially as something reifying, or sort of giving form to a commute and giving, dare I say, some kind of significance to the commute. Somebody like Victor Gruen, the kind of the saint of the shopping malls in the 50s, the Austrian emigre architect, developing ideas to not only to accommodate shopping in the suburbs, but sort of give them, understand them as somehow centralities. You have all these rather idealistic musings of Gruen on what was happening at the time, not so much against, I would say, the downtowns, but rather trying to infuse the kind of vitality these new suburban notions into the existing downtowns, famously with the project for the downtown Fort Worth, which was one of the earlier reconfigurations of a downtown. It would was a kind of recipe that would be applied in other places. And you see that Grün in his publication of his, let's say, in the propaganda pamphlet for the Fort Worth urban renewal as this section of Leonardo da Vinci, in order to kind of argue for continuing the tradition of sort of of elevating traffic, of traffic separations as a kind of means of solving what eventually would be the kind of traffic conflict. Here is interesting. I mean, this overview, that's Kalamazoo, Michigan, contemporary, slightly later, now Fort Worth, and you almost don't recognize it's an existing downtown anymore in the drawing. It sort of becomes formally, compositionally integrated within the way a shopping mall sits in the suburbs, surrounded by this parking, and you just recognize the pedestrianized main street. I would say that this kind of approach sits in this kind of tradition of reconfiguring the street section for other kinds of reasons and starting to understand a form of urbanism in function of all these things that need to accommodate and sort of compete for space, famously by Pierre Pat in the 18th century for Louis XV's Paris, let's say, and slightly earlier, the reconstruction of Lisbon under the auspices of the Marquis of Pombal. So this kind of emergence of what we now would almost overlook as the conventions of also organizing traffic in the city. So the way I want to discuss this sits somewhere in between these two images on the left and on the right. On one side, the city famously without cars, and sort of frame where San Marco Square framed by another administrative machinery, another bureaucracy, in this case the one of the Serenissima of the Republic of Venice, and a spectrum on the other side defined by this kind of futurology, or whatever you call it, of this kind of explosion of that idea of the accommodation of the traffic, the intensity in the city. So I want to take you to this area as to kind of arrive at what I would say is this kind of peak of the emancipation. The New York City, what is referred to often as the tri-state area. So it's a kind of meeting point of New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, this metropolitan area. And specifically, I want to take you to this area here, just north of the Bronx, just outside the city limits of New York. But before that, this is just before, let's say, or sort of conforming a moment in history. Fortune magazine in 1960s kind of talking about headquarters town and seeing the disproportionate importance of the island of Manhattan as the kind of location for the America's headquarters. Things I imagine everybody knows, in this case, the SOM Lever House, kind of early modernist skyscraper with exactly the same amount of cars, seems to be in the model as in reality. The model is on the right. Another kind of moment still in downtown. Well, the point is we're gonna soon leave downtown, obviously. The Chase Manhattan Bank, this kind of attempt at, while the Lever House is just on the northern edge of Midtown, Chase Manhattan Bank, a mega project, you could say, intended to revitalize in the 50s the slightly, well, downtown, the tip of Manhattan with the older kind of building stock by the same architects as OM. A project that was kind of as political as it was financial, in a sense that very much supported by the by Rockefeller, by Nelson Rockefeller, in order to kind of put the tip of Manhattan back in the game, a kind of process that would eventually lead to a decade later to the World Trade Center project. And then to this example, another sort of canonical example, again, same architect as OM, Bunshaft, and for the Pepsi Cola company, which would a little bit later merge to become the larger PepsiCo. And already in 76 decided to leave, in this case, Midtown Manhattan, to outside, to Westchester County to the north, where they, in this context, it's interesting to see that in the same kind of location before, obviously, the building was built. In the lobby, you would have this kind of planning exhibition on the post-war New York, because of course the developments cannot be seen separately, let's say, from the fact that the region had already sort of infrastructurally had developed the parkways of Moses in the 20s and 30s, and the kind of accessibility of different areas. The kind of framework was ready for it to be used. So contemporary too, and despite these kind of moments where, in this case, Midtown, for example, with the Rockefeller Center extension, the XYZ project of Harrison, would sort of claim its centrality, quite literally, with with a certain conviction. And also the kind of constant reconfiguring infrastructurally of how to make, in this case, downtown accessible for it, or how to have it remain accessible. Congestion and other kinds of issues. Congestion is the most general terms, interpret it as you want, lead to this kind of series of this kind of exodus, let's say, of the major corporations to the kind of the rim, the edge of the metropolitan region. So the same PepsiCo, or the same Pepsi, then later PepsiCo opened its New World headquarters designed by Daryl Stone in 1970. It's a kind of example I kind of like to home in, because let's say here the park becomes, the idea of the park and this sort of move into Arcadia starts to almost become, let's say, rather explicit. You see also that the actual work on the landscape and this, what was originally a publicly accessible sculpture garden, I think today maybe slightly less so, took a whole, was kind of constantly sort of adapted and improved, so that the headquarters in this case becomes actually sort of proposing a new landscape in this area. One of the things is, it's an area, in this case specifically, so Westchester County, where there is already things. I mean, there is a kind of historical, it's an area that's not, let's say, in the middle of nowhere, like some you would imagine it could be referred to. So it often finds the corporations and the developers often find places that are, for example, I think this was a polo ground or old golf courses or other things in order to kind of inscribe these new realities. This is taken from a few years ago, I think, from a kind of promotional brochure of the complex, where still the same original ideals of the corporate Arcadia are sort of used in order to argue for the kind of ideal condition and the correctness, let's say, of that 1960s move. Yeah, some of the sculptures, the complex itself, the sort of dural stone complex. So where are we again? So this is Westchester County. The complex, the PepsiCo building is in Purchase, which is part of this town of Harrison. So it's relatively close to the New York city limits. About, I would guess it's about 20 to 25 miles along one of the interstates. In this context, let's say. Nearby is the same area, Purchase, which is kind of an interesting name in this context. A corridor of the interstate there, which is referred to, or used to be referred to as Platinum Mile, has this kind of string of this type of corporate headquarters. This was originally Texaco, but then later Morgan Stanley, again SOM. This is a pay example for another headquarters. In this case, the Platinum, I think, refers to this kind of let's say the credit card companies. In this case, MasterCard. And then we nearby, not in Purchase, but nearby city White Plains, one of the many IBM facilities. So an administrative facility, so headquarter. And again, IBM in this discussion plays a kind of particular role, because you have to imagine that IBM had also a lot of production facilities, let's say, relatively nearby. So it's not just simply, there is a kind of industrial base in this case to the kind of location, to kind of a kind of strategical role for this location. You see the kind of same, the kind of the parking condition around it. I don't know the architect of this complex. It's also is probably in the 70s adapted a little bit. It's reminiscent of this architect in Stamford, Connecticut, which is almost a kind of, which would be really an edge city. I mean, the kind of 1970s in the detailed photo, the way they kind of filled up, made a new lobby in this courtyard, which is sort of sweeping drop-off situation at the entrance. But IBM, let's say, has a lot of facilities and has kind of migrated in different configurations throughout the area. I think within the context of a kind of production facilities as well. The next one, this one is the slightly more out, and the kind of IBM landscape in upstate New York. I mean, upstate New York is a little bit of an exaggeration because it's, let's say, upstate, not in the literal sense, but if you would consider upstate New York everything that's not New York City. What the Center of Land Use Interpretation, this foundation based in Los Angeles and Utah, calls the IBM scape of this area, this kind of archipelago of headquarters and research centers in this landscape. This is the Saarinen designed building for the research center. You almost see it's kind of a Berlin Tempelhof layout, where only the runways are missing, in this kind of vast tract of property with different facilities spread around. It's again the same building, and then also the backside with this kind of valley and the bridges. The interior with the famous Think slogan. and some kind of lobby, this sort of rusticated celebration of having, discovered this landscape. Another IBM example, again, bunch of SOM with later an addition, kind of 1980s pavilion in front, and then KPF's new version, which is nearby. So within the same terrain or within the property, there is different incarnations, let's say, of the headquarters. It's like instead of building an extension or a renovation, they kind of, sort of migrate over their own, in their own garden and try new things out. This is an unbuilt thing for a technology museum on the same Armonk property by Roche. Another unbuilt possibility for a headquarter on the Armonk property, again by Roche. This is in another property, but again IBM, another part of Westchester County, for a kind of a laboratory, again by Roche. So you see that again, it's a golf course that is kind of the starting point. I mean, that configures the property, and then a bit later you recognize, but the same architect, Roche. Goldberger in the New York Times at the time called it, so if Palladio had designed a spaceship, it might have looked like this. And we're again slightly nearer to the city limits, and no longer within the IBM scape, with the General Foods by Roche again. This is actually already the second incarnation of after the original move of the company out of Manhattan, where they first went to White Plains, and then this is already a second moving again, let's say, within this edge condition. I hope you always kind of recognize or sort of get an idea also of the area where these elements are located. This is more recent, and you have to imagine that all these examples are part of a current configuration. I think the first IBM example I showed, the one in White Plains, was, I think, is by now demolished, and the vacancy rates have been, let's say, since already quite a while, high, and the general development is to kind of find multi-tenant possibilities for these large concepts. Or first was finding multi-tenant possibilities for these large complexes, but now are turning more and more to rezoning the areas for more housing, etc., whatever the kind of demand is. So it's a landscape that essentially has disappeared. There is now, it's also, you could say, not suburban anymore in the kind of American definition, like zoning laws that wouldn't allow apartments, etc. So it's a kind of continuously transforming, and to a large extent, I think this landscape, or this kind of understanding of that landscape, is disappearing. Let's move across the state line into Connecticut. So the Westchester County is on the west here. This is the Long Island Sound coastline. Fairfield County, Connecticut, with this baby, the Union Carbide headquarters by Roche again. It's kind of parking garage with something attached, with some growth on the side, with its own kind of elevated multiple deck highway going through it in the forest. I think this is the kind of the peak of the radicality, and at the same time probably the most problematic of all these complexes, in a sense that a while ago, at least, it was referred to as the Matrix Corporate Center, in this idea that it would be a startup, multi-tenant, all the buzzwords thing. Honestly, I don't even know if it's still there. I imagine it's just simply too big to get rid of. It's interesting, being originally the Union Carbide Corporate Center. I think one of the issues, if you see the construction date, early 80s, Union Carbide was, of course, involved with the Bhopal disaster. So I don't think this were very soon the fate of Union Carbide went somewhere that maybe, you know, if you would have known this in advance, maybe the headquarters would not have been in its place. And it's interesting to jump back to downtown, to the original Union Carbide building in downtown, which was demolished last year. It's the largest building intentionally demolished. I mean, demolished not by people in planes, which was you know, the kind of one of the large modernist skyscrapers on, in this case again, on Park Avenue. So they moved from there to this Connecticut location. My personal favorite is this Bunshaft, again in Fairfield County, Connecticut, just across the state line in Greenwich. You see the landscape, the lakes, etc. You get the idea. And especially the kind of, it's almost the kind of the recipe, especially of Bunshaft and Natalie Bois, the close collaborator almost on all of these projects. This kind of almost neoclassical modernism. But in this case, what you're looking at actually for the main building, so that kind of 3-story height one sort of sits on an artificial dam, forming this artificial lake. So you see in the quote from architectural critic Ada Louise Huxtable, the kind of, you know, how that kind of relationship with the landscape always became more and more sort of ambitious, I would say. And if we zoom in, what the aspect I want to point your attention to, so you see this kind of dam-like structure across the valley, that kind of datum on which then the main building is created. The kind of, do you see my cursor? Yes. So the kind of drop-off area, you know, the whole kind of in-betweens, the approach road. And then, of course, I'm interested in this kind of treatment of the valley edge, which actually is probably the most elegant way to avoid internal circulation in your garage, because every floor of the garage sitting in this dam, I'm sorry, Jules, that I'm taking your topic a little bit, but is basically, so you use the existing landscape in a sense to organize your multiple level entry. So somehow here you have to decide on which floor you want to park, or somebody will tell you, or some valet will tell you, I have no idea how it works. And then you already arrive at the right floor into the building. This kind of decision on which level or where does this kind of infrastructural question become resolved? Is that an architectural one? In this case, sort of an architecturalization of the landscape. Yeah, in this design, how this would look on the approach. Okay, I have to hurry up. Okay, I couldn't resist. So if you would go further upstate New York, you have basically this government complex, which has its own highway essentially, which was supposed to continue, but this is the New York State Capitol building here and in front, Harrison's Empire State Plaza, or the Albany Mall, as it's referred to in Albany, New York, which is a kind of, just because I wanted to show it, the kind of extreme version of almost the building sprouting its own infrastructure around it. This is how you see it's a kind of similar condition as the American camp building of Burnshaft, but then the more rusticated, almost natural thing, of course, in a whole kind of artificial datum put where there used to be a neighborhood, mainly black neighborhood before, which was completely vacated for this pet project of Rockefeller, then governor. The anecdote goes that it was after a visit of Princess Beatrix, and he was ashamed of the shabby state of the state capital, and therefore this was necessary. And then the kind of interior spaces, obviously you have to imagine that this retaining wall is full of parking. Just to like for dessert, this moving out of the New York region, the Weyerhaeuser, former Weyerhaeuser corporate headquarters near Seattle, where they get a kind of similar, using all the necessary elements, the program itself, this kind of parking terraces as a way to kind of start to reconfigure this particular landscape. Yeah, you see the section half of the, you see, so you would imagine that this kind of stepping down into the kind of lake level would expose the building on those sides to outside, and on the other side it seems, let's say, half the height. And then also the kind of drop-off condition here, covered yet not inside, and then the different sort of thresholds created in the landscape, how to gradually emerge from your car, get used to, you know, first you step out on the asphalt and gets used to probably some other material, and then gradually get introduced to yeah, to this kind of world. And then an example much nearer, I could show obviously many examples of, I think, which followed a similar paradigm. I just want to show this one because I think it's interesting for the architect involved, for the company it was originally built for, because it was an IBM site, in this case near Brussels, and for the way it sort of illustrates the kind of reuse predicament, or whatever you want to call it, in the forest outside Brussels. So it was a research center for IBM, and the architect, is Danish guy Jürgen Bo, is actually the architect who designed what's the museum north of Copenhagen called, the one with the, if you go along the coast up from Copenhagen, there is this art museum on the coast. I forgot what it's called. Say again?
Louisiana Art Museum, north of Copenhagen.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, Louisiana. Thank you. So that's that architect designed, I think, also a museum in Dortmund or in Bochum. But here for this kind of what is essentially the suburban headquarters, well, office complex. More recently became a hotel / conference center. The other side of the coin, of course, of these kind of developments, in the case of Brussels, you could show many examples. You know, the way there was also this sort of oscillating relationship between the transformation of the city center and this reality, this landscape reality outside. Last slide, because it's Roche on steroids, because obviously it's for the French. So in this case, the telecom company near Saint-Quentin-en-Yvelines, so it's one of the areas outside Paris. Saint-Quentin-en-Yvelines is one of the satellite cities, the Ville Nouvelle, around Paris, on the west side in this case. one of the municipalities part of this kind of ville nouvelle, and then this you could say it's similar to the one well, the last example in Westchester County, but then let's say a kind of you would easily mistake it for some kind of Versailles from the aerial. And then the kind of particular subtle differences, the little differences in the treatment of the approaches and the traffic. In France, a roundabout is indispensable, and this kind of thing, right? The kind of the different, let's say, framing of it in the pre-existing landscape. All right, I think the rest we can leave if there is time for the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip, for the usually thorough presentation. Well, all of a sudden now got very bright again. Who would like to start with questions? No, Raymond is ready to go. Go, Raymond.
Okay. Hi, Philip. Or Philip. Hi. I was originally going to ask, or I originally noticed after seeing so many IBM buildings in Westchester and other corporate headquarters, that there are a lot of them, like you said, are like temples, big temples in Arcadia. But then you gave us 2 European examples. And then suddenly it seemed like there were more buildings, separate, disparate buildings in a landscape. And I'm wondering if you have any ideas as to why there is that difference between all these American big buildings and all these European not so big buildings.
You mean the fact that I don't, maybe it's just the kind of coincidence of the examples partly. I mean, I think you could make an argument about certain things, but I mean, if we would talk more about, let's say, the business park issue, let's say, right? I mean, there is always the question of agglomerating things which a developer could sort of split up and then have some kind of multi-tenant flexibility. So I think that that corporate headquarters moment was kind of unique in that I think that concern was not on the table. So I think I think it's more a question of chronology than it is of geography. That I think at a certain moment in time, the kind of flexibility becomes an issue of, let's say, the afterlife of the. So I think that might be the reason. That particular example outside Brussels, I think is I don't know. Maybe if we would talk about little differences, it could of course be very interesting to understand how this also relates to this sort of car situation, no? The way the kind of the approach and this sort of threshold thing, because I do think that's quite different, and I imagine also just how the conventions around traffic are already different in Europe and the US, to just use those two at that time. I mean, cars in Europe have always been smaller, right? And there's always been another sort of convention about how to move around, even in cars. I don't know if the Americans agree, but there is this idea in Europe that Americans cannot park because the parking spaces in the US are always so big, so you know, cannot parallel park. And if the typical American main street, you kind of can sort of diagonally bump into the curb and you're fine. So I think there is a kind of generosity that is still very evident in these examples, also in the layout of the landscape, in this, I would say, pre-73 examples, right? Compared to maybe the European, some European examples. I would say that the French ones probably are already exception, or maybe an exception to this, as there I think is a particular sort of, there is a kind of clear hierarchy, which is almost more infrastructural than it is landscaped, in a sense that this kind of perimeter logic of the, I mean, it's basically a variation of the many things which in this suburban area around Paris, with you have a zone industrielle, you have a zone commercial, you have this kind of entities. While I think especially in the Westchester County examples, there is really a kind of sort of, yeah. Imagine the infrastructure they attach to that is there often were already the parkways from the late 20s, early 30s. So there is already a kind of reformulation or a kind of artificialization of the landscape. While in these areas around Paris, the kind of moment is triggered by a much larger urbanization project. I mean, the fact that these kind of compete for land with other large-scale things. You know, in this case, well, the example of Roche being near part of Saint-Quentin-en-Yvelines, one of these new towns. So I think that kind of relationship building of landscape without the developer's logic, you know, that there is a kind of difference there. But I wouldn't say, I mean, you would really look at more examples to kind of make a general argument. I hope that answered it a little bit.
Thank you. Questions? Go.
Hi, Filip. Thank you for the presentation. I was just wondering if you...
Hello?
Hi, and thank you for the presentation. I was just wondering if you can talk a little bit about these buildings and their relation to the city, maybe if it is one, and how they impact the urban planning, and like going through this satellite and coming back to the city of where like these people come from.
I think you mean also as a kind of the experience of the commute, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So I don't think there is, I think the idea is there is no real coming back to the city. I mean, I think they exist in a context which you can describe in very different ways. But I mean, often one aspect is always discussed, not just for New York, but for many cities, that it is also a kind of controversially a kind of urban development that is, you know, an effect of the race riots in the starting early 60s already, and let's say a basic sort of degradation of the downtown areas because of serious socio-economical problems. So it's often explained in a sense that it's not just the suburbs, in a sense that people move out because you need cheaper land for your house, and you want to be farther away from the kind of dodgy downtown. But also that other things start to emerge there, and that there is almost a kind of no need to kind of retreat to the center. I think in the case of New York, there might be maybe less extreme as in other cases. I mean, you should ask Salomon about Detroit, where I think it's the most radical example, right, of having a ring of not just relatively wealthy, but extremely wealthy suburbs around kind of what historically for a long time was within the city limits, a kind of something that was turning back into nature. I have to say that today Detroit is much more a kind of no longer a donut, in a sense that, you know, all the fat is in the edge, but it's as if there is something else in the center again, because the downtown itself is sort of the last 20 years quite sort of redeveloped again, but then still you have a sort of in-between zone, which is difficult. So within this kind of geography, I think the moment these examples I was showing capture, it's more the kind of idea that you could, you know, you could just suffice with kind of commuting in the area, because you probably live in Westchester County, and you have a relatively short drive into the office, which has all kinds of facilities. There will be good schools for your children, all these kind of things. And then maybe once in a while for some kind of weird meeting, you have to go into downtown. Or so that's basically also in this city thing of or discussion of Garot in the early 90s, was that there was a kind of emancipation of these exurban products, you know, that sort of start to coexist with the traditional city, and that in a sense the traditional downtown start to pick up at a certain point and sort of participate in this kind of more regional dynamics. I think today there is kind of winners and losers. I mean, but it's a kind of boom or bust logic anyways, right? I mean, I don't think they are necessarily even representative of like an office market discussion, because square meter wise, you know, there is other parts of the tri-state area that, you know, like Stamford, Connecticut is like, I don't know, the office market there, it's like not that much cheaper than Manhattan. And it used to have all kinds of headquarters. And not even for like tax reasons or something, right? It was like, you know, because I was trying to find if there is a logic to go over the state line or these kind of things, because, and it's difficult to really, within the tri-state area, it's quite, yeah, it's not that different. So it wouldn't have that much of an effect. In Stamford, Connecticut, for example, I think, what was the big, what is the big Swiss, Union de Banque Suisse, UBS? I think the biggest trading floor in the world was in Stamford, Connecticut, where the idiots were like, you know, doing the trading, like in a big stadium space, until the big crash. So, and I think that's where the real square meters are. And there is also no, I mean, that's an urban condition that's on the coastline, on the Long Island Sound, along the main infrastructural corridor, I-95, etc. While this kind of Arcadia, or whatever you want to call it, that was I think it was a sort of, it's kind of specific moment, no? It's like, I think I mentioned Mumford to Jules before, but I think it's interesting also to understand it in how it sort of was in, I would say, intellectually prepared, in a sense that when Mumford with the Regional Plan Association of New York in the 20s, etc., you know, the way also the car plays a role in that, it's like, you know, sort of readies, or sort of lies a kind of base work to understand that the landscape in a certain way, that there is, you know, that can be appropriated in a certain way. And this kind of idea that in Mumford's word, like, you know, that the technology of the car, there is something specific to this technology. For example, you would also say that the train in the end, you know, spurs a certain type of development, but relates to a certain landscape as well. I mean, it's difficult to put trains in a mountain. It's a pain, you know, you have to tunnels, this kind of winding things. So it's heavy. So there is something inefficient about hauling a train onto topography. While this idea of the internal combustion engine, the car is light, so it's like we can go up in the hills, you know, we can go, that there is another landscape that is, or that the car privileges another landscape somehow, in a certain sense. And I think these things are more anchor points in that kind of world which you could inhabit than that they simply only exist within a sort of satellite relationship of a commute out of town to that thing. No, you also live there. The commute is somehow cancelled. Well, there is still a commute, but it's a kind of commute that's much less than sitting on the metro rail for like an hour. Okay, long answer, sorry.
Thank you, Philip. Just a slight digression. I was just thinking about what happens in a place like Norway, right? Considering that was the site of our thesis project last year, and how basically it's highways are the things that connect, and not public transportation, right? So it's either helicopters, planes, not train tunnels, just to substantiate your observation, right? So the country's connected by highways, but not by train. Anyways, just think about that context. Also, maybe
you asking me, Salomon?
No, I was just reflecting that. I mean, it's the substantiates your comment, right? That reality.
Okay. Yeah, no, I think
about related to past, let's say, Berlage research to kind of.
Can I say something about that? I think it's a discussion on another sort of scale. I think, first of all, I think there is a situation where this kind of condition where you anyways do infrastructure, you know, even, you know, in Norway, in Norway, it's a sort of, you know, it's almost a form of maintenance, right? And the distinction between making sure a part of the rock doesn't slide into the fjord is, you know, taking care somehow of this landscape, and that involves infrastructure. And the role of the infrastructure is a very different one, because let's say you would make a tunnel, not necessarily because you want to go quicker to the other side, but similarly to Switzerland, because then you can have the road not go through the village, right? So there is a kind of ease in sort of starting to reroute paths in function of the car into the landscape by means of tunnels, etc., in order to kind of create this on a landscape scale, this separation. I mean, if you think of the Transjura highway in Switzerland, this kind of meandering route, of course, is because of the geology of the Jura, but it also is in order to always be in the mountain when it would be annoying if it would be outside the mountain. So they're looking for the mountain. So it's not like, I'm making a road, there's a mountain, I have to make a tunnel. No, you start to orient the road in order to be able to make a tunnel at the place where you can then avoid it, you know, going close to a village. So in that sense, I think that's very much tied to how the car has in that context, a kind of different relationship to the. It's back absolutely. To your ostrich question, no?
Yeah.
It's
absolutely.
Like, yes, you relate to the landscape because you're inside of it, not on top of it, let's say.
And maybe just before we need to move on to the next topic, just another kind of reflection, because we have, you know, 4 Mexicans in this generation. I mean, it's also the highway related to this observation, the infrastructure and the highway in the last 25 years or even less has dramatically changed across the entire country from what was accessible before. So I mean, just to kind of also kind of relate these things, you know, I mean, in Monterrey, it was something very different to get from Guadalajara to the Pacific coast. It's now something completely different where it was, you know, 2-lane roads. There's all, you know, dealing with congestion anyways, but just for these guys to think about that. Thank you, Philip, for the talk.
Thank you.
I think we need to just endurance. So let's go through so that we have time to, after Andrew, then Chester will come in, then we have time to basically ask Janina some questions if there are questions. So
It's a pleasure to have Andrew joining us today from Ottawa, Canada. He is the author of Sleeping Around America, visiting the Roadside Motel. He has a passion for the motorcycle, so he embarked on a 10,000-mile journey across the US, visiting over 50 hotels. He calls an MBA hospitality and tourism from the University of Guelph. So we're very much looking forward to Andrew's presentation and looking at some neon signs and photos from his motorcycle trips. Thank you, Andrew.
Hey, thank you very much. And just to confirm, hopefully everybody can hear me okay. It's a real pleasure. A little bit of background before I get too further down. I'm going to just correct one thing. I'm actually delivering this today, this talk from Toronto. This is my first overnight sleep in a hotel. I'm actually at a Holiday Inn at a roadside hotel in Toronto today. So if there's internet connection issues or something like that, bear with me. But I thought it would be appropriate to deliver this talk from a roadside hotel, at least anyway. I couldn't find a good motel to stay at last night. So I'm gonna just delve in a little bit more just on the background as to, and let me just qualify this by thank you, Salomon, for the invitation. And it's a real pleasure to be able to talk to you guys about, you know, I mean, this is an interesting symposium into itself. I do not have an urban planning background, just as and I'm not an architect. So I'm going to do the best to answer my questions as best I can, but I will go into a little bit about my history, a little bit more about my history. I've spent over 3 decades in and around the hospitality industry. I've risen through the ranks and worked right across North America for chains starting from you know, including Holiday Inns, Intercontinental Hotels, Crown Plaza Hotels and Resorts, Hilton International, but then some more of the roadside motels as well. Hotels like Travelodge and Best Western, as well as a bunch of independents as well. So I sort of come at this from an operational marketing branding standpoint, and that's the way I sort of approached my work. Little interesting thing is, as I mentioned, you know, I'm staying at a Holiday Inn here in Toronto right now, and the first Holiday Inn actually was opened by Kimon Wilson in 1952 in Memphis, Tennessee, and so it's kind of a fun little segue, and I just wanted to bring that up. It was actually, this hotel sleep was actually booked well before the presentation was, so it's just coincidental that I happened to be here. The book, thank you, Salomon, for giving it a plug. Yes, Sleeping Around in America is the name of is the book. Yes, it's a folks in the audience, this is definitely a sort of a nod to the pillow trade that the industry has taken over the years. We're going to get into that in a little bit, and I'm just going to start sharing my screen so I can sort of share with you some of the fun pictures, and sort of walk through a little bit about what I want to talk about here. Just give me a second. I gather you can see that here. So what I wanted to do this morning, for this afternoon, and I realize it's a Friday afternoon for everybody, is sort of give you a brief history of the motels as a building type, as an accommodation type, how they began, where it came from. I'm going to get into the architecture on a very basic level, folks. So, but I will talk about the different types of motels that were constructed, how they were constructed. I'm going to show you some examples today, clearly. on how they've evolved over time and how that has changed. And then I am going to focus a large part of the, or a portion of this into the future of motels and where I see them going into the future. So hopefully this is going to be fairly quick. I've timed myself for 20 minutes, so, and I've got 15 minutes left. So I'm going to try to run through this as best as I can and hopefully answer your questions at the end. Okay. But just so you know, I mean, there's been an evolution of motels, as you can start to see now. I'm sorry about that. Yeah, there's definitely been an evolution of motels over time. What you can see in that image right there, right now, is that there, it should be a little bit bigger. There's been we've seen a bit of a resurgence over time, over the last little while. But to really understand where we are going, you have to understand where they came from. And the first motel was actually, or the first, what we would look to see was the first motel, was actually the Askins Cottage Camp, built in 1901. Now that's prior to, of course, the automobile becoming a popular chain. But this is the first idea that we can see of construction of a motel, in as much as in Douglas, this was built in Douglas, Arizona. They were actually a series of cabins that were lined in a single row, and they were designed originally for miners' camps, for the mining community. And then what happened by 1910, they actually changed the name, because to accommodate auto tourists, they actually changed the name to the Askins Cottage Court. Now, the name motel itself first appeared as a word, I guess, in the lexicon in San Luis Obispo in 1926. Okay, so but it was originally a hyphenated word, so it was mo-tel, and that was in 1926. That motel actually closed a few years back. Is actually used as a headquarters now for another hotel chain. But the first unhyphenated term of the word motel could probably be dated to 1929 in Flagstaff, Arizona, and that's the Motel du Beau that you see the picture of right there. That was built along what was then being constructed as Route 66 as a major gateway to get people from one side of the country to the other. But I talk a little bit about the past and where it's gone, and we've seen that it has a bit of a colorful history. I mean, motels over the years have played a role in not only American dreams, but also some of its worst parts of history as well. The Lorraine Motel, as you see pictured on here, is actually in Memphis, Tennessee, and that was where Martin Luther King was shot in 1968. It's also pardon the poor choice of terms, but it also has a colorful past as well. Many people may not know of the Green Book that existed, but there were certain motels that there was a very bad period of time in U.S. history, and to some extent still exists today, where there was segregation. So there was an actual book designed, published annually, made famous by a movie a few years back called The Green Book, where people could actually stay and had listings of accommodations. So the industry, it has taken a real turn over the years, and it's become popular again, motels, in 2018. But I want to sort of give you an idea of the number of motels that exist. And I think that is probably, this will probably give you a better indication. There's one of my favorite pictures taken from my trip, because this is almost as where we're going right now. But let me just share some figures with you. In 1928, there were 3,000 motels listed in the AAA, or then AAA, directory of motels. And I have to give fair warning, there was a whole bunch of different terms for it. But there was a research, as you can tell, you can see that it grew in popularity and actually peaked in 1961 to 60,951 motels in operation in the United States. By 1987, we started to see the decline, and a fairly precipitous decline started to occur. Then down to 40,424, and then by 2021, I estimate now that there are probably 6,000 independent motels in operation today. So where do I get these numbers from, and what happened? There was two things that happened to the motel industry, as we all know. The growth occurred as a byproduct, strictly as a result of a post-war America and a desire and the resurgence of the automobile. So downtown hotels occurred for a number of years, but really what we saw was a huge growth in people getting out with larger disposable incomes. Then what happened, and that sort of peaked around 1961, but there was also something that happened concurrently at the same time. And this was and what was happening here was what was actually happening at this point, there was a change that they had to help promote infrastructure within the United States. They adjusted the tax codes in the United States. And so what happened here is that they allowed for construction of motels for those who built motels and the purchase of motels to actually depreciate the property value over a 7-year period, which is a very short period of time for depreciation. So what was happening is that these motels were being built and cash was readily available for people to be able to invest in them. And they were turning around and buying these motels, investing in them, and then taking out their capital gains and then flipping them. But as a byproduct of that, it became an ongoing cycle. Now that changed. I'm going to go back to that slide again. That changed again in the mid 80s. And that's where you can start to see the decline starting to occur. It wasn't shortly thereafter that the American Hotel and Motel Association changed their name in early 2000 to actually drop the word motel completely from their lexicon, and now it's the American Hotel and Lodging Association. Okay, so that's not coincidental by any stretch of the imagination. So it was really this change in the tax code that really affected the shift in business travel patterns with the development of the interstate that has really created the downside of the motels as we know them today. Sorry. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the design types, because I know this is an architecture program and we wanted to focus a little bit more on the architecture a little bit. So let me just bring up this next slide, and let me just make it a little larger for you so you can actually see it. Motels were actually designed in basically 3 ways. I call it the I, the L, and the U, okay, for lack of a better term. And I have to give credit to a book called Motels in America, The Motel in America, which was published some years back to actually to find the source of this image here. So I'll put that link in the chat afterwards if anybody's interested. But you can see it was they were all done in a very similar type format, and it's really designed. I'm going to show you some examples of how that looked in today as well. And here's another way we can look at it. You can see that, you know, the original cottage camps changed into cabin camps, which then changed into integrated design. And then you can see as the history progressed, it turned into the motel court, then one room, and then one lot row without the garages attached. And then of course the the motor inn, and now the highway hotel in which I'm staying at right now. There are some examples of what these look like today, because there are still a few of them, and I was able to actually, fortunately, see a few of them while I was traveling. One of the earliest examples, this is outside of Carmel in Big Sur. It is a series of cottages that are all attached. It's over a 300-foot bluff over the ocean. It is absolutely gorgeous to stay there. The Lucia Lodge is what is the name, but it's been in operation since the early 1930s. But another example of the cottages all lined up in a row And this is along the Lincoln Highway in Pennsylvania, and this is the Lincoln Motor Court Inn. And that is in Man's Choice, Pennsylvania, about 2 or 3 miles away from where from that flight went down during 9/11. So, but what's unique about this is that in this case, you can see that they are individual cottages, and they are lined one along the other. And these were actually designed, you can't see it fully here, but they were designed in a U as well, with a central court where people could gather. Another good example is down in St. Francisville, Louisiana, and where you can see 2 cottages with an adjoined carport over top, to actually house and put your vehicle inside. This 3V tourist court in St. Francisville is just it's one of the few remaining, that and the one in Man's Choice, Pennsylvania, which are 2 of the few remaining with attached garages and carports associated with it. I'm going to just share one more because they come in all shapes and forms, and this is in just outside Elko, Scott's Motor Court, and just so you can see it. And here's one more example of the Motel du Beau. In the Motel du Beau, again built in 1929, and this is where they sort of got a little smarter, because the owner operators of these facilities recognized that they would in turn, if they actually attached everything together and got rid of the garages and the carports in between, they could get economy of scale, and then they could actually save on things like heating and other costs, and then park people's vehicles out front. And this is the picture at the beginning. This is the Blue Swallow Inn in Tucumcari, New Mexico. So, I mean, these buildings took on different shapes and forms. I mean, there was no, these are some of the earliest indications, but I mean, some people got a little creative, and these are the ones that I'm sure you're a little more familiar with. This is the Wigwam down in Arizona, village number 6. And I could go on with stories about how this was created, but this was the number 6 in what was supposed to be a franchise of these units. So there's another image of it there. And in fact, what they did is they built a 2-story motel in behind. That's the structure you see in behind it as well. Just to make it more fun and more touristy, they've also populated with a whole bunch of rust bucket cars from the 1950s, which makes it a little more interesting. And of course, this is the big Texan in Amarillo. But one thing you can see between the designs of these is that all of these properties have exterior corridors, and that's a really important feature. This is sorry, you're looking in Savannah, Georgia, at the Thunderbird Inn in Savannah right here. And then I'm going to finish the look and feel of motels with this image. It's not the best image in the world because it was so hard. It was such a big footprint, but this is a U shape that is integrated with both a carport. And what's unique is, remember that picture that I showed you earlier, which was the Green Book. That image I just showed you was the Inn of the Dove, and that's in Dallas, Texas, and that's one of the motels that was actually featured in the Green Book at the time, and one of the few remaining motels that still exist today that are still in the Green Book. Quick side story, because it's just an interesting story. When I approached the owner and talked to them about this, they didn't even realize that the historical significance of this property when they bought it, when they purchased it. And that'll segue into a story later on, which I want to talk about, is to the future of motels. But that's just a neat aside that they have this incredible piece of history. And as I showed you the Wigwam earlier, I'd be remiss if I didn't go ahead and show you the Railroad Motel, because they have a whole bunch of cars that they've just brought together, and they put the word motel in front of it. And this is, you sleep in old railroad freight cars. This is Reading, up in California in Reading. So I just wanted to give you a heads up. And so these are the different types of structures that were built, and they were built fairly cheap, which is another reason why we see fewer and fewer of them around today, because they weren't designed, as we mentioned, with a 7-year life cycle. They weren't designed to be around for a long time. Some of us stood the test of time. We've had many owners that have really enjoyed it, but others have not. But one thing that has been constant as that boom occurred in the 40s, 50s, and into the early 60s is they had to find ways to advertise their property. How do you make a property stand out a little bit more? And one of the and so what became really key is the motel sign. Now the sign became iconic because that was the way it was able to stand out and literally make it, you could see it from the highway, and then it would beckon the travelers to come in. So there are all sorts of examples of how signs were used. And this is the Rocket Motel in Custer, South Dakota. Some of a little flashier than others. We have the Magic Beach Motel down in Florida. And then, you know, the 3V Tourist Court was very plain. And this is the one in St. Francisville. Some are the beautiful neon that we become familiar with, the Caribbean in Wildwood, New Jersey. I'm just showing you some various examples, but where I'm going, and some are a little more phallic, you know, let's call it what it is, the Austin Motel. It kind of stands out a little bit. Anything to catch your attention. It's, you know, they're playing to that pillow trade as well. But really what they were doing, remember, this is the days before the brands were really took a foothold in the United States. So what they would do is they'd make it as big as they possibly could. And in this, and that's why I'm showing the Motel Safari down in Tucumcari, because it's a great example, you would often see what they would have, their unique features that would be advertised, whether they had Simmons mattresses, whether they had air conditioning, telephones, televisions, remote control, and they would put the brands of those brands onto theirs. So basically trying to co-brand with them to be able to make them differentiate so you can stand out. So we saw that development come up through the 1950s and 60s, and that's where because remember, neon was only introduced in the 1920s into America anyway, and it was its first use in motels. As best as I could track down, wasn't until the late 1920s, early 1930s. So the motel sign was a differentiator, but then the other thing that became a differentiator was the swimming pool, to turn these motels into a resort. We wanted to be able to make sure, this is the Beach Carousel, by the way, in Virginia that you're looking at right now. And so we wanted to really give you a good indication that they wanted to make it as attractive as possible. So the various motels would build these pools for families to be able to enjoy. And as you can see, some of them are fairly elaborate and rather pleasant looking. So almost giving you a resort experience on the way out. Now, sorry, I'm just going to grab a sip here. I also wanted to talk about, we talked about the exterior a little bit, the signs. It's also important to take a look at what the actual guest rooms look like. This guest room that you're looking at right now is in Wisconsin as the Holiday Music Motel. It was actually known as the Holiday Motel. It was opened at the same time as the first Holiday Inn in Memphis, Tennessee, but because it opened at the same time, they were excluded from having to worry about having to change their name. So they were sort of grandfathered allowed to use the name. But this motel is actually with all the same, and they've maintained it to preserve it, so it's using all the same 1950s furniture exactly as it was when it was built. There's no recreation, so everything is authentic. The only thing that's newer is the mattresses, apparently. But because the motel itself, I mean, when you think about it, it's a room with a bed. Right. So how do you differentiate this? I mean, and it's the same, it's the vacation traveler that's using it, as well as the honeymooner, as well as the business traveler. So you have to sort of make it somewhat generic. That said, the motels recognize that if their real market was vacation travelers at the early days. So they became a little more, and are coming again to be a little bit more, how would I say, a little bit more loud. And this is a good example of that. This is in Wildwood, New Jersey. And I'm going to just show you some guest rooms on how they're differentiating themselves right now. So the Cadillac Motel in Niagara Falls. It has a mural of a Cadillac, of course, over top. The big Texan we talked about in Amarillo, it's a Western theme. Do you remember the phallic symbol at the Austin Motel? Well, this is what the inside of the guest room looks like there, you know.
there was one of the motels that I stayed at was Kate's Lazy Meadow up in New York State. Now Kate is Kate from the B-52s. I don't know if you guys are all probably too young for that, but you remember there was a popular song in the late 80s called Love Shack. Anyways, she created a Love Shack and bought a motel in the Catskills. And so this is kind of a far out guest room of the Love Shack at her motel. You want to see what's the wigwam, which was an Adobe type construction of a teepee, which was not actually a wigwam but a teepee. So this is what the inside of a wigwam looks like. Down in El Trovatore, you can see that, this was a James Dean themed room that I was staying. This is where all the stars stayed in Arizona. And then sometimes the motels have gotten really elaborate. I mean, it looks like it's a French palace. But there were also quite a few that were not so good. Now, this is one of those motels where you don't take off your shoes when you walk on that carpet. You grab gloves before you actually pull off the bedspread. Actually, you just don't sit on the bedspread at all, whatever you do. Never sit on a hotel bedspread anywhere. Just a good rule of thumb, folks. But yeah, and some of them were not so nice that I stayed at as well. So they weren't all glamorous and beautiful. I'd be remiss if I didn't, because I only have a couple minutes left, and I recognize I want to get through this a little bit faster, but if I didn't spend a little bit of time on the Googie architecture that was so prevalent in Wildwood, New Jersey. Now, if you're looking for the greatest collection of mid-century modern motels in existence today, you have to get to Wildwood, New Jersey. And I'm going to show you a couple of them right now. But what Googie so I had to sit down. What you're seeing right now, and the image you're seeing in front of you, is an actual museum that they've created. And some of the motels that did not stand the test of time were actually torn down, but they preserved the signs and put it out as a motel sign garden out front. And there's an actual museum inside there with the whole history. But there's over 200 remaining motels still in operation in Wildwood, New Jersey, and they have a very strict code onto how to maintain them and preserving the development of the coast. So, and they take there's the Lollipop Motel, the American Safari Motel, and of course the Aztec Motel. But then, of course, the most popular one is the Caribbean Motel, and I say most popular because it has the most space age look to it. So what is Googie exactly? Googie is a combination of represents as according to the president of the association. Actually, he suggests it actually represents the rock and roll era, but also the futuristic atomic design idea, the jet set age. This was a time in history where people were moving forward. I mean, Expo 67 was taking place in Montreal. Things were just moving at rocket pace, literally, around the world, and people wanted to be a part of it. So the design of the motels very much took that form. So you can see here we have the floating ramp that brings you up to the second level in this design here of the Caribbean Motel. There's a lot of angled iron in the design work as well, with lots of glass and steel coming together, which I think is really cool and very unique because most of the buildings were constructed out of wood at the time. So, that brings me to the next question. I walked around, I traveled around, as Salomon had mentioned, and I took 50 days to spend 50 nights and stay in 50 different motels and ride 10,150 miles around the United States. So what does that actually mean for the future of motels now? And there was two things that I'm going to go back, as I said, I would segue back into where we are going now. Sorry about that. And I'm leaving with this picture here, the Drake Motor Inn. two things happened. Why didn't they disappear completely off the landscape? Let's get to that. The reason why they didn't disappear completely off the landscape in the 1980s when the tax codes changed and the tax codes changed and the interstates had already shifted business travelers away, is that there was a new generation of people that sort of came in. And the New York Times wrote an interesting story about this, and this sort of happened around the late 70s, beginning early 80s. And the New York Times referred to it as the Patel Motel Cartel. And these people are the ones who have actually salvaged the industry. And let me just say a little bit about that, talk a little bit about this, because I don't get into it too much into my book, but I want to, it sort of talks about the changes in society, societal changes that occur in the United States. Remember that the original motels were mom and pop shops. They were individuals, small business owners. Often they built a fuel station, they added a restaurant, and then the motel was a natural extension of what was actually occurring at the time. So what happened in the 1970s, late 70s, early 80s, we saw a huge immigration influx. Now, the reason why the New York Times referred the article as the Patel Motel Cartel is because that we were getting Indians were immigrating to the United States, and they were looking to invest in businesses. And many of them wanted to get into the motel industry because it was a perfect way to be able to settle in the United States, as well as at the same time settle in the United States, as well as at the same time give them employment and a place to live combined in one location. So that's the cartel that was developed, is that they started trading motels literally in amongst themselves, because the banks were discriminatory and would quite frankly not finance their projects. So they would find wealthy investors themselves and finance the projects amongst themselves. And that's why many of these motels are actually owned by immigrant families today. Now, so what we see is we talk about getting it back to the future as to where this is actually going to go. And I'm just looking at my time here, and I think I've got just 2 minutes left. We look at the future, and then what we have here is that we've seen two things that have evolved. We have what I call typical roadside motels and destination experience motels. Many of the images I showed you today were of what I would call the destination experience motels. Even the ones like the Lucia Lodge at Big Sur, which was probably the most expensive motel that I stayed at during my trip, charges well over $350 US a night. That was this one. And so no longer is this a budget option for people when you're staying at a motel, when you're going to the destination experience motels. However, I can't. You have to go back and say, you still have the it'll do motels out there as well that'll finish off, and you can get these for a large for not very much money at all. So at the end of the day, this is from the Drake Motor Inn, with the only new construction property that I stayed at. This was a postcard in my room, and I think that will give you a good idea as to the state of the motel industry, and hopefully answers some of your questions as to how the motel has evolved over the years of the automobile. And I'd be open to answer any questions you might have. Hopefully that sums it up. How do I do for time? Pretty good? Just in time?
Any questions from the students?
Hi.
Hi.
Christy, thank you for your presentation. Quick question. I'm not sure if I understand very well, or if you mentioned what is your vision for the future of the motels, and the other one is a tiny comment. If you have ever study or get to know about motels in Brazil and the different connotation that they have from North America, which I think particularly is very interesting from what happened yeah, in North America. Thank you.
I'll answer that the second question in a second. But so, okay, for the future of motels, it's a little uncertain. Since 2018, we've started to see a resurgence. The pandemic has absolutely devastated this industry as a whole. These are small, medium-sized enterprises. Travel as a whole, domestic travel has been horrible. The United States has just opened its borders to foreign travelers now. So with any luck, it could start to rebound. That said, and let me add to this, if you just Google search the daily news on motels, you're going to see horrible things every day. There are shootings in motels on a regular basis. They catch on fire. City councils across the United States are acquiring motels or derelict motels or rundown motels to turn them into social housing. So if you would have on a list of potentially extinct products, it would be on an endangered species list for sure. That said, there is a large resurgence of interest in the destination experience, the romanticized version of many of what we are seeing now, okay, of the great American road trip. We are still seeing that. People feel somewhat safer in staying at roadside motels than they do in larger traditional hotels. The exterior corridor is one reason, even through a pandemic, so there's a sense of hope going on there. There's also a sense of people are, based on what I'm seeing as well, is that there are two demographics that are traveling more and more. The boomer demographic, of course, they have disposable income and they're still getting into cars. And then, of course, the millennial demographic, which didn't grow up with the motel as I did. You have to understand, when in the 1970s, to stay in a motel was a big deal. You look forward to it. You could things we take for granted today were firsts. Air conditioning, you could experience air conditioning. Not every home had that back then. Cable television, that was huge. If you had HBO, heck, you had remotes. You could eat TV, you could watch TV in bed. Most television households only had one television. So the fact that you had one in your bedroom that you could lie down in was incredible. But what we're seeing is a resurgence of this of a millennial generation who are fascinated with the Americana and the interest in retro, and so there is some hope that strategically placed that they will survive, but they'll survive in a different way. They're not housing the business travelers as we know it. These are literally destination experience motels where you travel for vacation and leisure traveler, not the roadside construction crew anymore.
Well, maybe
sorry, the second part of that question.
Just to substantiate that argument, I mean, there's I don't know who has seen the Netflix series Motel Makeover. And it basically takes you through the whole pandemic. It takes. Have you seen this yet? There are two moteliers that have done their second. They did one successful renovation of a motel, and now they do another. They do another one, and then it takes you through. It stops during the pandemic, but it's very much geared towards destination experience and millennial demographic. So it's a kind of interesting. They have like a very minimal budget. So it's basically about paint and found objects and something between a kind of Pinterest aesthetic and found things. So anyway, arts and crafts, but it's an interesting, I think, thing to know.
April is the owner of the June Motel, one of the co-owners of the June Motel, and they were the first ones I interviewed for when I did the
This is the series, so it's the second. Yeah, it's the second iteration. That's right. It's the second version of the June, and then they're picking the colors. What will be the colors? How do you deal with this brown shingle, 70s kind of thing? Anyways, and as somebody who, as a kid, did a lot of road trips across the US, the Holiday Inn, the Great Sign, That was always, you guys gotta look that up. Fantastic. Yeah. Other questions?
Well, let me just respond to the yes, there is a completely different connotation, to the different connotation to motels in Brazil, and I don't have first-hand knowledge of it. However, I will say that Anne d'Hauteville, who was the first lady who actually who traveled the world on a motorcycle back in 1972, she stayed in the in Brazilian motels, and she has some very interesting observations, but it has much more of a sexual connotation from what I gathered. Anyways,
what's her name?
thank you. Anne-France d'Hauteville, she's from France. She is the first woman to travel, literally in 1972. She traveled the world on a 125 motorcycle. Beautiful lady. She's still alive today. And I count her as a dear friend. But yeah, she's, if you get a chance, you should look her up and Google her. She's written a couple of books. They're only available in French. They were never translated, and German. They were never translated to English. But a beautiful person and really great reads. Anyway, sorry, I digressed.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jesse. Thanks for your lecture. I think it's a very interesting tension between luxury at the one hand and the other side, kind of the efficiency and the very non-luxurious image. And like I was kind of looking at these diagrams that you showed, starting from these kind of individual houses, which to me have this kind of, I mean, they were small, but it feels like kind of luxurious in a sense. And then towards the modern one, which is like efficient, one building, you mentioned something about the heating being, but then also evolving into the resorts again. So I wondered if you could elaborate on this maybe a bit more about this like luxurious thing that is also present in these motels.
Sure. So like the roadside hotel that I'm staying in right now, probably 125 rooms. It's along a major highway, designed primarily to accommodate the urban sprawl that we've seen within Toronto. Okay, but this is not, and this is exactly why we haven't seen or a byproduct of the decline of the motels, because there's no longer need for them. But the resort element of the motel that I was referring to, yeah, it's become a truly a leisure-driven activity now. They are not capturing, so you'd have to look at in the early days when hotels were first built. I mean, and I alluded to it earlier, it was the same product that was designed to accommodate the business traveler, designed to accommodate the honeymooner, designed to accommodate the family vacationer, all using the exact same product for three different distinct purposes, right? Now we have a product that is designed more so in these destination experience motels to be strictly geared towards the vacation-oriented traveler. So the business traveler, the traveling salesman that they used to accommodate in the 50s and 60s, they don't exist anymore. So that market has disappeared. Where many of these traditional or motels and many of the roadside hotels are still accommodating are the, construction crews, that kind of business traveler, small conferences, that kind of stuff. But these destination motels that we're seeing the resurgence of are not geared towards that market at all. It's strictly a leisure travel vacation market. As a byproduct of that, they don't have the ability to be able to they don't have the ability to make as much money 7 days a week. There aren't as many travelers on a Sunday night as there are on a Friday and Saturday night. So the rates that you pay for these properties are very, very high because they have to literally they're using yield management systems to be able to or make as much money as they possibly can in a short period of time. Many of them are also only seasonal. The June Motel that Salomon was referring to earlier up in Prince Edward County here is only open from April to October. It's people aren't traveling to Prince Edward County in the winter months in Canada. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Maybe Filip, Janina, Chester, do you have any questions? Hi, Chester. Just like you're the last one, Paul? Oh yeah, go.
Hello, I'm Pavel. Thanks everyone for your talks. I have a question for Janina actually. If we can get back to the Neutrust Church, I was wondering, I think I read that somewhere, but I'm not sure, if it's true. So maybe you can confirm. And I think I also saw that in the sort of video snippet. I read that the service itself was actually radioed to the people who were sitting in the cars, so they could actually tune in. And I think I saw that in the video that there was actually the radio was operated by the person leading the service actually. So he was sort of standing in front of the like a pult of some sort. And I guess I was interested, or I was sort of intrigued by this idea of let's say, the institution of a church being amplified to a much wider audience. And I guess in that sense, I'm curious, and this is where I'm, a little bit ignorant. I don't know much about the context, of that particular church, and also whether, this is really much more of a separate instance rather than, like a trend that has occurred on a broader scale at that time in America. But I'm curious, to which extent this, let's say, ability to amplify actually, the contents, if it could be sort of detected also in its ability to become an urban catalyst as a church, at that time. Is it, or was this, particular instance, was it a church that sort of, or whose catchment area was, a community or a neighborhood, or was it on much, broader scale, or, and I guess also to which extent it was deliberately used as an urban catalyst. Maybe to put it even more vulgarly, or more vulgar manner, to which extent it was sort of used to valorize, the surrounding properties. I think perhaps in a similar fashion as I think the institution of a school is, seen, nowadays in the States, also something that kind of is able to, build a neighborhood.
Thank you very much for the question. Broad question. I will try to respond as best as I can. I think it's very interesting that you picked up that Schuller in this Garden Grove Community Church chose to broadcast his sermons over the radio, because if you look into Schuller, I think it's sort of the start of the, I'm very conscious that there's people who know the North American context much better than I do here, but I think that was sort of the start of the mega church, because on that plot later they built a much larger church that serviced thousands of people at the same time. And it was also, I think, the start of this sort of the sort of televangelists like Billy Graham, and Schuller was sort of part of that school. So to really put the church sort of in a public sphere through new media, through television at that time. In terms of what it did for the urban development of the neighborhood, I don't really know. But one of the things that I've been sort of amused by as I was listening to these talks is that it seemed that on the surface of it, the church is the only, on the surface of it, again, I want to repeat that, the church is the only sort of non-commercial type, but of course we all know that churches are just as much a business as a motel is a business. So I don't know what the effect was. I have to say I don't really know what the effect was on the urban development. But it's a very good question for you to investigate further, I would say, in the seminar that you're doing, in the masterclass that you're doing.
Thank you.
everybody should be proactive and go to the camera.
Hi, Janina, I want to ask you a question. Do you think this type of churches were more, how do you say, were more, well, the younger generations were more interested in this type of churches?
Well, that was the hope, I think, for these churches. I think that's why they came up with the type of drive-in churches, because young people were turning away, or were, the numbers were decreasing, and they were trying to get with the times. And I think they were hoping to appeal to a younger demographic. To what extent it actually worked, I don't know. But I do think that this notion of the mega church, this is going to sound sort of terrible pop culture-like, but if you think, for instance, Justin Bieber sort of supports one of these contemporary mega churches, and now there seems to be a new interest of really young generations, if I can call him young, in religion, because of this phenomenon of the mega church. So maybe in the long run, if you look at it over the long durée, what this has done, maybe yes, but I don't know if it worked like that at the time, because I do think there was a sort of decline from the 70s on, and particularly in the 80s, sort of in church attendance, and before there was a sort of resurgence again.
So hi, Mariam. It's there is this book from Vittorio Aureli called "That's Is Enough," where he talks about the churches in general, the church, and how new archetypes of the church, the way that commercializing the church, this effort that in general the Vatican was trying to selling the church, the religion, to a larger, say, audience in order to acquire more fellows, somehow was the actual destruction of the church itself he was writing in the book. So do you think this, this kind of churches, this archetype of the church, does feed into this process of the church to try to expanding its audience? And do you think it contributed to this sort of destruction of the church, as Aureli was saying? Just this.
Well, thanks. This is a very interesting comment. I haven't really, or suggestion, I haven't really thought of it that way. I think the way it was really thought of in the 80s, which is at the time, the Archbishop of Canterbury wrote a sort of opinion piece, which was called Faith in the City. And his hypothesis was that the decline of the churches had to do with the fact that churches had moved away from the cities into the suburbs. How that sort of correlates, or if there's a connection to the source that you're mentioning, I don't know, but I find it very fascinating to look into that, because you could also, I think it's a valid hypothesis to say, because they became so commercialized and so large, that's also, they lost a bit of their spirituality in that sense. But I think religion has always been a business, so I think maybe they were just more upfront about it in the latter half of the 20th century, that they were a business. But yeah, I think that's a great suggestion. I think there's various theses that circulate about what the cause was of the decline.
Yeah. Thank you, Janina. And thank you, Andrew, for your presentation. I may need to ask you which software you use for your slides, because I hadn't seen that before, so I loved it. And it's a pleasure to welcome Chester and to have him here with us. Yeah, we can hear you. We can hear you.
Hello. Can you see me?
Yeah. So good.
Are you seeing me full screen or partially screened?
Partial at the moment.
How do I, all right, how's that? Is that full screen?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Yeah.
Good morning. Yeah.
Just to introduce you to our students and to our guests. Chester is a landscape historian, preservationist, and international heritage educator. He's a professor emeritus at the University of Vermont. and the author of Main Street to Miracle Mile, American Roadside Architecture, where he dedicates chapters to drive-in theaters, gas stations, even the miniature golf course as a type that appeared along the road. He's the recipient of 2 Fulbright fellowships to Japan. He served as a visiting professor at the University of Tokyo and Columbia University, and adjunct professor and George Beer Fellow in the University of New Mexico. So we are very much looking forward to Chester's presentation. We had a brief conversation last week about the scope of his presentation. So yeah, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much. Well, let's see. You're way in the evening there, right? At 5 o'clock or something. I just got up quite early, so I might not be at full strength here. Actually, I'd like to just get right into my presentation. And I have not done one of these PowerPoints before on Zoom. I would have preferred being invited to Delft. Probably that might have been what would happen before the darn Zoom age is destroying our travels and lecturing. Anyway, so I turn on my Zoom first, my Zoom presentation. Let me minimize my screen. And any of you can chime in and help me if it's going badly, okay? So I'm opening my Zoom, and then I'm putting my Zoom on full screen. But
you have to do share,
and then I have to do the same with the Zoom program, right?
On the bottom it says share screen.
Share screen. Yeah, I read up about all of this. See if it works. Okay, I'm sharing. What do I do next? Do I click on the PowerPoint?
Yeah. Select
Beautiful.
PowerPoint.
It's going smoothly so far, we hope. The PowerPoint is way down there. That's not good. And then we want to get rid of all this junk they call Chrome, which would include all of you, wouldn't it? So how do I make it full screen now?
It's perfect now.
Is it? Are you seeing it full screen, or because I'm just seeing? I'm seeing lots of.
If you just click the full screen within PowerPoint, then we'll be.
There we are. Does that work?
Perfect.
Perfect.
Yay! Thank you for all your help. Okay. You are sharing your screen. Stop here. So it's warning me that all my stuff will be on Google or something. Stop share. No. Can I just want to get rid. I have an artifact that you might not.
Like, you don't want to stop sharing. This is how we see it. So
no, I don't. I'm just trying to get. All right. I might. Do you see something that says you are sharing screen? Stop share on your. No. It's sitting right on top of my presentation. It's very annoying. Let me. There we. Well, nothing. Anyway, good morning. I was involved with roadside architecture perhaps quite a few years before most of you sitting in that room, including your professors. Now I have to. Now the PowerPoint won't advance itself. Now that's not good. Why would that be? There we go. There I am around 1970. I was one of the very early graduates of a program at Columbia University started by a gentleman named James Marston Fitch. It was one of, not being a chauvinist, it was one of the first in the world. I suspect Columbia claims that. I suspect there was some others as well, but it started in 1964, and it was a program in historic preservation and in the conservation of cultural heritage. After that time, in our early work in cultural heritage, many of the states in the United States began surveys, which really for the first time took a much more comprehensive look at what was called the built environment, cultural environment of the country than had ever been done before. Different scholars had picked off different pieces, whether it's the Greek revival or colonial buildings or something like that, but not looking comprehensively at the cultural heritage. And one of the things that happened during that time is there was a lot missing. The previous speaker mentioned motels and the Green Book, and certainly looking more and more at the cultural heritage of underserved and people who were excluded from the American experience. And we were looking, for example, at industrial heritage. And very soon, an organization began called the Society for Industrial Archaeology, kind of paralleling some of the things that had happened at the time in the UK. And before that, industrial heritage, industrial workers, their complexes, their surroundings, it was not particularly looked at in American architecture and its study. And the same thing happened with the roadside commercial landscape. Now, this was not a time yet when mid-century modern, as it's called now, wasn't called that then, wasn't so fashionable as it is now, and googie and all that stuff. And a lot of people who would begin to think this is important were looked at as a little crazy by the academic community. It had, now it's quite fashionable. But there were an increasing number of grassroots movements that began to be interested in diners and other roadside phenomena. And it hadn't really reached the academic world yet, except for some interesting things like learning from Las Vegas, the Venturi and Rauch study on, which was somewhat of a polemic for architectural ideas, but nevertheless exposed the commercial roadside, at least as it existed in Las Vegas, and then started with a decorated shed and the duck and all that stuff. And there have been some books on gas stations and motels. But I set out after helping found something called the Society for Commercial Archaeology, which still exists today and is very active. I thought it would be good to try to write and put in some context or perspective, not every last word. This was a vast topic, but to put in some context and perspective of the American roadside architecture. And so I started working on this in the late 70s, and by 1985, this is a Johns Hopkins second edition, but by 1985, Main Street to Miracle Mile was published. If you hear me stumbling, I got up very early, and it's very early for me still. Professor Laval asked me to talk about gas stations specifically, and I said, no, well, you know, type is fine, but my great interest in that book was context, because people are looking at, oh, this cool motel, oh, this funny little thing here or there, and how did this all evolve? How did we change from our main streets to what I call the miracle miles, to the vast stretches of roadside art? You travel across the United States on a road trip today, and you see endless, I won't try to make an aesthetic comment, but for many Americans, kind of trash the continent, sorry. Endless roadside architecture. How did this happen? And so I was very interested, and as you can see in this image, of when the main street, can you see the cursor when I use it? No, yes? Yeah. Yes, that's a miracle. I guess I could have made a funnier looking cursor. That would have been like an automobile or something to be more fun. Anyway, you can see the street wall in this illustration of the main street. And you see this in European cities too, of course, with a sidewalk and then buildings on High Street hugging the sidewalk. And how did this begin to break? How did we begin to get from Main Street to Miracle Mile? And so what is considered probably the biggest contribution of my book, and we'll talk about type later, was identifying what we call the taxpayer strip. And the taxpayer strip was along streetcar lines promoted by streetcar companies who were selling lots and encouraging development outside of central cities. And along the avenues of the streetcar lines, little one-story buildings would develop, still hugging the street wall, but with many individual buildings. And like this is a good example of a taxpayer strip which survived in Boston quite late with its streetcar. But you can see these buildings were considered to be taxpayers. They were just there to park a place, to reserve space, because it was assumed that the old urban dense city and Main Street would come out and envelop it eventually, and it was just placeholding that land. And so this was the taxpayer strip was really the intermediary between the Main Street and the roadside strip. Eventually, as you can see in this example in Los Angeles, some of the earliest roadside-oriented buildings, freestanding eating places, and gasoline stations and whatever, began to populate the outskirts of the taxpayer strip. So it was really the taxpayer strip was a very, very important phenomena for seeing the evolution of the roadside strip. And as it appears today, this is a shot I took in Fresno, California in the 80s, but one can still see this beautiful scene of America today, depending on how you view it. And someone asked a question about motels in Brazil. I've never been to Brazil. I'd love to. Someone invite me. I'd love to go to Brazil. But I have lived in Japan and traveled extensively through Europe. And this is an example of the version of the roadside strip in Japan. People bicycle, less use of the car, but still the phenomena is not restricted, of course, to the US. And then I went on to what I call the architecture of speed reading. And I thought that it was quite profound when you think about it, how in the horse age, if you're riding in a horse and wagon, first of all, the horse does a lot of the thinking. It's sort of like old-fashioned autopilot. Maybe Elon Musk should take a ride that way. But the horse did a lot of thinking. You drank too much that night. The horse knew how to get home. I think they did pretty well. But suddenly, with the automobile, you had total control of what I call the movie through the windshield. You could turn the wheel and step on a pedal and change this ever-ending landscape. And that's the first time in history that people could do that. Before that, you're riding on a train, you saw a cinematic scroll passing through the train window, and only the engineer owned the vanishing point. But this was a profound change with the automobile. And this movie through the windshield began to be populated with a whole genre of buildings that were designed to catch the attention of this movie through the windshield. And it's very, very early example of it, but quite interesting, and I go into that quite a bit. But finally, on to type. Professor Laval was fascinated with this image of a patent drawing of the first drive-in theater that I dug out of the patent office. Now I suppose you could get that online in 2 seconds. I actually had to travel to the patent office and do a lot of research and go through papers, and I think there was a payment and permit that was involved to get this drawing. So research in this topic was a little bit different. But on to the gas station. I assume most of you or some of you were assigned or read through my chapter on gas station, and there are some other good books on it that diagram the evolution of the gas station from the house to the various iterations of the box to the canopy gas station I'm showing here. And this is one that I took in the 1980s. Yesterday morning, I went around my neighborhood to get some fresh views of gas stations and see what's up. And the latest type of gas station, the canopy gas station, it's gone through different stylistic innovations, but basically hasn't changed a heck of a lot. The pumps have, and they now take credit cards and etc. You know all this. But the gas station is always paired, almost always, with either a convenience store, because the function of repairing cars has disappeared. That's gone to other repair shops or to the dealers themselves. There are very interesting pairings with convenience store owners. This is AM/PM. Does AM/PM exist in Europe? Anyone? No. I was surprised that it's quite common with conveni or convenience stores in Japan, and I didn't know we had the chain here until I discovered it yesterday. And this is a corporate convenience store chain that is coupled with the Arco gas company to provide a gas station. The scale of these gas stations right here might look a little small. There are gigantic ones with dozens of pumps along the American highway, but taking a similar form. One of the reasons, normally in a class I could say, can anyone guess? But I won't do that to you this morning. In the state of Oregon, where I live, they still, as in New Jersey, require that someone pump the gas for you. And so the scale of the stations tend to be smaller, maybe more frequent, but a smaller size. But many other couplings can be found with gas stations, car washes. Here the car washes takes up a lot of the property of the gasoline station, a very small canopy, several pumps, and the attendants have a little kiosk. Gas stations now are paired with national chains, much more than when I wrote Main Street Miracle Mile. You'll find gas stations and Starbucks, for example. Now, many gas stations, this is starting with the oil crisis of the 70s, but the very older gas stations have been abandoned or have disappeared, like this box type gas station with a streamlined office that you see. But there's a lot of repurposing going on. Right in the north side of my city, I found this very curious Signal gas station. And I still need to research, was Signal ever a brand? And I think you could see in this gas station, this did exist. I looked it up and it was actually built in 1941. I thought it was a little late for this type of gas station. But this one drips with nostalgia. It's now a coffee shop, but it has its requisite gas pumps that were bought from some salvage somewhere. It is neon bedecked more than a lot of gas stations were originally, because with any sort of mannering and nostalgia, they often are more like the original than the original ever was. So this is one type of repurposing of gas stations that one can find. But this gas station, do you have Ben & Jerry's ice cream in the EU or the UK or other countries? I see a very international group.
Dutch owned, Unilever.
It is owned by you. Yeah. Well, I'm going to talk
so
about
it's
something else that's Dutch. There's going to be a Dutch-owned theme coming up here. Yeah, Unilever owns it, absolutely. When I went there, it was just two guys and some other staff sort of saying, "Hey, man, what flavor do you want?" This was, it started as kind of a a hippie enterprise. This isn't Burlington, Vermont. This is actually the original Ben and Jerry's, which started in a gas station. But just to suggest, there's lots of this type of repurposing of older gas stations going on in the States. But for you, especially for architects looking at the future and seeing a great opportunity with gas stations, sure, there's an opportunity with design and repurposing, et cetera, and enjoying them and learning about them. But we're at the crux of something that is quite profound. Just as in the end of the horse age, and automobiles started appearing, where were the first automobiles repaired? Where were the first gas stations? They were often in blacksmith shops or livery stables, and you can see this sign, auto livery, is a transition between the horse age and the automobile age. And the earliest facilities for automobiles and garages were in downtown. You can see this cornice and the street wall basically were born on Main Street. And then the gas station broke away and gradually evolved. The internal combustion gas station, that is. But what about the future of gas stations? And I took this image that Tesla is putting out. I don't know how many of these you have in your respective countries, but right now still in the States, charging stations. I tried to find in my city charging stations attached to old-fashioned internal combustion engine-oriented gas stations, and I couldn't find any. Most of the charging stations were in front of supermarkets, and they were higgledy-piggledy here and there. But at some point, as electric cars have a greater and greater use and internal combustion engines fade, there will be a profound change. To what extent will existing gas stations be retrofitted for charging? To what extent will new forms evolve? One great difference, depending on how fast the cars charge, is in an internal combustion powered station, unless you're hungry and maybe on a longer trip where there's a cafeteria or restaurant and there's parking or a truck stop, basically you're in and out. You pump and you're gone. But with charging, you have a captive audience. And so this presents a very interesting problem or opportunity of taking advantage of that. It'll be interesting to see how these develop. And I assume that many of you who are architects or will be practicing will be involved in designing electric car charging stations. What will we call them? Gas stations. That's kind of old-fashioned. There'll have to be a new name for this type of gas station. Finally, and speaking of Dutch-owned corporations, I believe Shell is it not? This is a photograph, greatly enlarged, that of a Shell station taken in Albany, New York, in 1970. With my learning to read the landscape students, I would actually have them decode and tell me exactly when it's stationed, when it was built, from the various, using cars as guide fossils and all sorts of complicated things, but I won't do that to you this morning. But this is a gas station, again, that was off Broadway in Albany, New York, and it was in the path of a giant highway, the Northway, that was going right down the Hudson River, and this is where the gas station was. And a colleague of mine, an incredible colleague, Paul Huey, who was a historian of the United States in the 17th century, plotted that the first Dutch settlement north of New York City, major Dutch settlement, was around something called Fort Orange, which the Dutch East and West India Company were building these bastion fortifications at different colonial outposts. And this was also a time of, I believe in my history, of a lot of polarization of the Dutch landscape and expansion of the landscape. And Fort Orange was actually down by the Hudson River, sitting on the mudflats. And then over time, Broadway was built, which actually connects to Broadway in New York City. A lot of fill happened, and on and on and on. The city actually raised up about, I forgot the number of feet, but quite a bit, to the level of that Shell station since the early 17th century. But deep beneath that Shell station, see, and this is a personal experience for me because I was the historian for this project. It was not, Paul Huey was the main archaeologist, but I was given a lot of historical research tasks. But I also did actual troweling in my own designated sector. And I found this incredible Dutch artifact, okay? A Rummer, I think it's pronounced. Some of you correct me. It's been a long time since I lived in Holland, which I did for a short time. These are raspberry prints. And here we have that same type of artifact in a 17th century Dutch genre painting. So I thought those rather interesting. Beneath a Dutch Shell station, with you all sitting there in Delft, beautiful Delft, that connection way down below to 17th century Netherlands. So that's about all I have to say this morning. I lost you all. Goodbye. Where are you? Hello, can anyone hear me?
You have to stop sharing.
Okay, I got to get rid of this thing. I will. Let's see. How's that? And then we'll get rid of that. Screen sharing has stopped. And now you can see me?
Yes.
Wonderful.
Yeah. Thank you.
I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
We'd like to open up to the students. Working at gas stations, charging stations, working at the driving theater.
Actually,
hi. Hi.
Hi. Thank you for
I can hear you, I think.
Thank you for the lecture.
Hello.
Hi. For us, I guess, for all of us in this room, what you've shown us is very far away and distant, so to speak. But for you, I guess you lived it, right? You experienced it. You experienced it all yourself. And so I'm curious to know, as time has passed, and as things like, gas stations or maybe signage on the side of the road in many, many towns and cities in America have changed or stayed the same. I'm curious to know if your personal thoughts on these things have changed too. For example, maybe when you were, in the past, maybe you thought they were a bit, what's the word? Not vulgar, but a bit cheap, so to speak. But now, have your sentiments changed on these things?
Sorry if I conveyed that I didn't think they were cheap. Actually, I was interested then not so much as works of design, but expressions of culture. And if you're going to study American architecture, it was what we were trying to do is expand the arc of what people were looking at. And so for me, it was important to do it. And I wasn't so much looking at it as being good design or bad design. For many people then, when I wrote the book, it was considered to be quite, I'm gonna say revolutionary or not troublesome, but a little bit naughty. And then it has become quite mainstream and international with such interest in it. But I don't think I was looking at it with an idea of being an aesthetic critic. In terms of today, it is fascinating to me that the old saying that if you live long enough, it's new again, that for whole generations, there are pieces of this architecture that, especially the mid-century modern, that people have found incredibly exciting. And that's just fine. As someone who lives in North America, and you go on an American highway on a road trip, as one of my friends said recently, we've lost many of our small towns and cities, or they've been reduced, all our small businesses and reduced to maybe just antique shops. A lot of the texture and beauty of the American landscape has been lost with the roadside strip. So it's complicated.
Thank you, and sorry to insinuate if these things were cheap. I did not mean to do that, so
I'll
my
forgive
apologies.
You. No, that's fine. When you said it was interesting in your question, that's all right. You said, go ahead, go to the next question.
Adi?
If there is one.
Yeah. Hi. So you mentioned, can you hear me? Yeah, okay. So you mentioned the stores AM, PM in
Yes.
at the beginning of the presentation. And I'm from Israel, and in Israel, there's actually a huge distribution of convenience stores in the city that are called AM, PM.
Yeah.
This probably just started around a decade ago. We've never had that before. They're all called AM, PM, and they're 24 hours open. And then I guess the gas station convenience store probably started around 30, 40 years ago in Israel. I'm not exactly sure about that. So I'm curious, I lived in New York as well, and there are a lot of 24 hours bodegas also inside of the city, which you pretty much don't need a car to go get anything you want at any time you need. So I'm wondering if you also see a connection between how these, I don't know, extended highways, evolution of a car, going to farther places, and then the distribution of convenience stores. But then in metropolitan cities, they became, well, they're almost doing the opposite, as opposed to getting into a car and find a, I don't know if I'm clear, sorry. I'm just wondering if that was maybe an evolution for 24 hours convenience store in a city, those types of convenience store and gas stations. I don't know the timeline, for example, in New York versus that happening in America.
I've not, a lot of my studying in this area, because I went on, I did a book that's published unfortunately in Japanese and not in English, that's really was studying Japanese bicycle culture and looking at Japanese traditional neighborhoods and the approximation of convenience stores and other things as incredible templates for low-rise density instead of high-rise density for the future of cities. So I'm just saying, but I don't know how I can answer that. I'm sorry.
Okay. Thank you for trying.
Oh, it's a good question, and I had the answer and then I lost it.
Thank you.
I had to do this thing yesterday, and I had all sorts of problems with compatibility, and then something else happened. I also have to see the doctor in about an hour. Please give me some good questions, and I apologize that I was not able to fully answer your question, or even partially. Next.
Hi, I'm Alonso. We talk about nostalgia, and I was thinking, now we are living in this revival era that we are like trying to experience things that we really didn't experience in a real time. And I was wondering what kind of experience drive to the creation of the cinema or drive-in cinema. It was clear.
It's a little difficult for me to understand maybe the audio.
I was wondering what kind of experience drive to the creation of the drive-in cinema.
Ah, what type of experience led to it?
Yeah.
As I recall it, and this all in my book that I wrote and forgot, but the inventor, whose name is in the book, he actually took a movie projector and put a screen up in his backyard and showed this and said, we're onto something. And actually, in this case, you can see its beginning. Actually, there was a patent for it. And then they began in the early 1930s.
One last question.
Hi there.
Hello.
You spoke earlier about Elon Musk and his self-driving cars and self-driving horse carriages.
Yeah.
On that note, I was curious if how a tool like Google Street View, where you're able to endlessly roam the streets to some extent, has informed your work, or how does a tool like that help you?
Fascinating question. We didn't have it.
But today?
Today, I don't, I'm not working on that today. However, no, I think it's a fascinating question because it shows the possibilities for your generation that is using this actively, and the ability. I traveled thousands of miles and contributed to in my small way to the destruction of our planet to do my book, and I had to do it real time. And it is amazing that you could use street views. I have used street views to check once in a while for lectures to see what's happened to a building over time. I mean, it's an incredible resource for so much for your work now, but I did not use it then. My work was analog, man.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome. No, thank you. It was a great question.
Hi. So I thought, so for example, now in gas stations, we see like a rubber stamped model because it's the same canopy, same everything everywhere. But because you showed pictures of the earlier ones, which are not cheap, but I think have a lot more character in them. So when do you think that shift happened? Like maybe one of the reasons is convenience of building, but is there any other reason why and when that shift happened from a more interactive sort of gas stations to a more get in, get out structures?
You're talking about when convenience stores and gas stations became more common, or?
No, like when did the sort of the architecture of it became standardized? Because the earlier ones, each gas station sort of did look different.
The first, I can answer. The first standardizations were in the 30s. Actually, even before that, with the house type gas stations, to make a gas station that looked like a little house so that it looked friendly away from home. There were standardized designs. In the 1930s, darn antivirus shouldn't do that. In the 1930s, industrial designers like Walter Dorwin Teague and Frederick Frost became involved sort of on the side, beginning to design gas stations, the famous Texaco gas stations with the streamlined stripes, green stripes along the side, were all standardized. So I would say in the 1930s is when that began.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You notice I'm sorry if I cheated you a little bit here in the sense that I suspect that people read and would know the evolution of the types of gas stations. I think it's important to look at the context of roadside architecture and its history. So I stressed that a bit in the beginning. And I do hope somewhere in your countries lurking under some gas station, there might be some amazing archaeological evidence that to be considered. Yeah.
Thank you for a very nice coda to our symposium. Thank you for waking up early. Thank you for indulging our invitation to look back at a project that's 35 years old. And thank you for, even if you are a professor emeritus, you are clearly still a professor, so thank you for your didacticism and your talk. So you still got it. Good luck with your doctor's appointment, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you for inviting me, and I very much appreciate it. Thank you.